I never thought peace could sound like waves. I just finished restoring my dream cottage, a quiet corner of life, finally carved for myself, when my son-in-law smiled and said, "It's perfect for my parents." His words hit harder than a storm. My home, my sanctuary, suddenly became someone else's plan. I stayed quiet then, but I already knew. If he wanted to move them in, I'd show him what moving really meant. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning light stretched across the Oregon coastline like a soft blessing, spilling over the weathered boards of Henry Blake's newly restored cottage. Seagulls cried above the surf as he ran a hand over the polished window frame, oak, sanded and sealed with the care of a craftsman who still believed in earning peace, one nail at a time. The cottage was small but sturdy, perched just high enough on the bluff to catch both the salt wind and the view of endless water. After 40 years of labor and loss, it was the first place that felt like his. A house made not for family gatherings or plans, but for quiet. He'd spent months rebuilding it himself, every hinge, every floorboard, until the rhythm of work drowned out the ache of losing Claire. Now, as he looked around, tools neatly stacked and the air scented with fresh pine, Henry thought, "This is the last thing I'll ever need to finish." That afternoon, he heard Emily's voice before he saw her, bright, familiar, echoing through the breeze. "Dad, you did all this yourself?" She stepped out of Darren's SUV, face flushed from the cold. Her husband followed behind, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored jacket, gaze already sweeping over the property with a professional kind of curiosity. Henry smiled and waved them in. "Come take a look. It's not big, but it's mine." They walked through the cottage together. Emily trailed her fingers along the counters he'd built, the window that framed the ocean like a moving painting. "It's beautiful, Dad," she said softly. "Mom would love this." The words hung between them, simple, sincere, and for a moment, Henry felt Claire there too, in the warmth of sunlight and the smell of sea air. He nodded, voice tight. "I think she does." Darren's compliments were measured. "You did a great job with the layout. Perfect size for a couple. That deck alone could add another 50 grand in resale." He chuckled, but his tone carried calculation, not admiration. Henry noticed it, but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that some men only saw homes as numbers, not sanctuaries. They shared coffee in mismatched mugs, the kind Claire had once collected from flea markets. Emily took photos of the view. Darren checked something on his phone between smiles. When they finally left, Henry stood at the porch railing, watching their car disappear down the gravel road. He breathed deeply, feeling something close to peace, a fragile calm he hadn't known in years. He went inside to tidy the mugs. The house hummed with that rare kind of silence that feels alive. The floor creaked softly under his weight. Waves rolled steady below. He imagined evenings here, books, radio, maybe a small fire. A man could live out the rest of his life quietly in a place like this. Then, as he stepped onto the porch to lock up, voices drifted through the open window of Darren's still running car. Emily's tone was low, uncertain. "Do you really think your parents would want to live all the way out here?" Darren laughed, easy and confident. "Perfect size for my folks. They'll love it." The words froze Henry in place. For a second, he wondered if he'd misheard. But no, Darren's voice carried with the sea wind, casual and certain, like a decision already made. Henry's hand tightened on the railing. The horizon blurred behind the sting of salt air. What had started as a blessing suddenly felt like a question he hadn't asked for. The ocean kept moving, indifferent and endless, as the first chill of unease slipped beneath Henry's calm, quiet but certain, like the first crack in freshly poured concrete. The following Sunday, Henry arrived at Emily and Darren's house carrying a tin of homemade biscuits and the familiar hope that family brunch might still feel like it used to. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint scent of lemon polish and new furniture. Their home always felt curated, more like a showcase than a space for living. Darren's influence everywhere, from the sleek countertops to the precisely folded napkins. "Dad, sit anywhere you like," Emily said, moving quickly between stove and table. Her voice was warm but tight around the edges, as if she were keeping something inside. Darren poured orange juice, his smile polished to perfection. "Glad you could make it, Henry. We don't get to catch up enough these days." Henry settled into his chair, glancing around the table. Family pictures lined the walls. Emily and Darren at business events, vacations, open houses. Not one showed them by the ocean. He brushed the thought aside. "Food smells good," he said. "You two always eat like royalty." Darren grinned. "Well, you taught me something about building things to last." His tone had that practiced charm, smooth and hollow. Then, as he reached for the bacon, he added casually, "Speaking of building, Emily and I were talking. What would you think about my parents staying at your cottage for a while?" Henry paused mid-bite, biscuit halfway to his mouth. "My cottage?" "Just temporarily," Darren said, voice still easy, like it was a harmless idea. "You're hardly there during the week, and they've been looking for somewhere peaceful to stay while their house gets renovated. It's perfect." For a moment, Henry chuckled, assuming he'd misheard. "That's a good one," he said, shaking his head. "You had me there." But Darren didn't laugh. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "No, I'm serious. It's empty most weeks anyway. You could help them out, and it'd keep the place occupied. Everyone wins." Emily's fork clinked softly against her plate. She didn't look up. Henry's smile faded. "Darren," he said carefully, "it's my home, not a rental, and I built it for quiet, not company." Darren's lips tightened just enough to show the crack beneath his civility. Of course," he said, tone light but eyes sharp. "Just thought it made sense. Family helping family, you know." Emily finally spoke, her voice low. "Maybe it's something we could talk about later." Henry glanced at her, his daughter who used to run barefoot through sawdust, who once called him her hero. She wouldn't meet his eyes. A dull ache spread in his chest. "There's nothing to talk about," he said softly. "I'm not loaning out my home." The table went quiet. Even the ticking clock seemed louder. Darren's smile returned, but it had lost all warmth. "Sure," he said, pushing his chair back a little. "Didn't mean to step on toes. I just thought you'd want to keep it useful." Henry folded his napkin neatly beside his plate, forcing calm into his voice. "It's useful to me exactly as it is." Emily reached for the coffee pot, hands trembling just slightly. "Who wants more?" she asked too brightly. Darren waved her off and glanced toward the window, jaw flexing. The silence that followed wasn't angry, just heavy, the kind that seeps into walls and lingers. Henry looked at his daughter once more. He said quietly, "You doing all right?" She nodded without looking up. "Yeah, Dad. Fine." But her voice cracked on the word fine, and in that fragile sound, Henry heard what she wouldn't say aloud, that something deeper was shifting beneath their family's surface, something that had nothing to do with generosity or home renovations. He finished his coffee, thanked her for the meal, and stood to leave. "Good brunch," he said, though no one answered. Outside, the winter wind caught his coat as he walked to his truck. Through the kitchen window, Darren's silhouette moved closer to Emily, his hand resting on her shoulder, as he whispered something Henry couldn't hear. He started the engine but didn't drive right away. Instead, he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, the calm face of a man who had just felt the first true tremor beneath his foundation. The road home was quiet, but Henry could already sense it. The next crack was coming. By mid-January, the calls started coming every morning. Darren's number flashed across Henry's phone like clockwork. Always cheerful, always helpful. At first, it was small talk. How was the weather on the coast? Did the heating system need tuning? Did Henry ever consider installing solar panels? But soon, the conversation always found its way back to the cottage. Just thinking long-term, Henry, Darren said one morning, his voice wrapped in practiced warmth. A place like that needs upkeep, you know. I can send my guy to check the gutters, maybe repaint the trim. Henry smiled faintly, leaning against his workbench. Appreciate the offer, but I've got it handled. Oh, come on, Darren pressed. You shouldn't be climbing ladders at your age. Let me take some of that off your plate. Henry's voice stayed calm. If I stop climbing ladders, I stop being me. Darren chuckled, but the sound didn't reach his eyes, even through the phone. All right, just offering help. When Henry hung up, the shop was silent again, just the steady hum of his old clock and the faint sound of gulls outside. He knew what those calls meant. Darren wasn't offering help. He was testing fences. By the end of the week, Emily had started echoing her husband's words. It came gently at first, harmless suggestions tucked into otherwise ordinary talks. Dad, Darren's just trying to look out for you, she said over dinner one evening. You've been working so hard lately. Maybe letting someone help isn't such a bad thing. Henry studied her face across the table, the way she twisted her napkin, the hesitation behind her smile. You sound like him, he said quietly. Emily looked away. It's just family, Dad. Those words landed heavier than they should have. Just family. The same phrase Darren used when trying to corner him into agreement. Henry sipped his coffee and said nothing. Sometimes silence was sharper than argument. 2 days later, Pastor Reed stopped by the workshop. The old man moved slower these days, but his eyes still carried that steady kindness Henry had leaned on for years. They stood outside, steam rising from their mugs, wind cutting through the cedar trees. Reed listened without interrupting. When Henry finished explaining the calls, the visits, the tone beneath the politeness, the pastor just nodded thoughtfully. Patience, Henry, he said. You taught me once that a carpenter measures twice before he cuts. This is one of those times. Henry gave a faint smile. You think I'm overreacting? No, Reed said. I think you're being tested. Let them reveal themselves. You'll see the truth in the open. That evening, the test arrived. Henry was sanding a chair leg when a car pulled into his driveway unannounced. He wiped his hands on a rag, stepping out just as a woman in pearls and a designer coat emerged, smiling broadly. Mr. Blake, she said, I'm Nora, Darren's mother. He blinked, momentarily disoriented. Oh, hello there, Nora. She looked around with casual admiration. Such a lovely spot. The ocean, the air. It's just what I've been dreaming of. Then, without asking, she stepped past him onto the porch. I thought I'd take a few measurements for curtains. Darren said it'd be fine. Henry froze. Measurements. For the guest room, she said brightly. We'll want to make it cozy before we move in. I prefer linen over lace, personally. Her tone was polite, but the assumption in it sliced clean through Henry's composure. Nora, he said slowly, I think there's been some misunderstanding. She laughed lightly. Oh, I'm sure it'll all get sorted. Families always find their rhythm. Henry stood there as she stretched a tape measure across the window frame of a house she did not own. The sound of the metal reel snapping back felt louder than the ocean outside. When she finally left, waving with oblivious cheer, Henry remained on the porch long after her car disappeared down the road. The wind bit sharper now, the sea darker, restless. He looked around the cottage, his walls, his labor, his peace, and realized how far the quiet invasion had already gone. It wasn't anger that filled him then, but something colder, awareness. Plans were moving, strings being pulled, and all of it disguised as family concern. That night, Henry didn't sleep much. He sat by the window, the house dim except for the glow of his lamp. His reflection in the glass looked older, harder, as if something had shifted permanently. By dawn, he had decided on a new approach. He wouldn't confront, not yet. He would wait. Watch. Let them show their hand completely. And when they did, he'd be ready, calm, measured, and unshakable. The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked neatly among bills and grocery flyers. Henry almost tossed it aside, until the return address caught his eye, Seaside Haven Homeowners Association. He slid it open with his pocket knife, expecting another update on lawn regulations or neighborhood watch meetings. Instead, the letter began with warm gratitude. Dear Mr. Blake, the HOA Board thanks Darren Blake Investments for your generous contribution to our Community Beautification Fund. Your support helps us maintain the coastal charm we all cherish. Henry's brow furrowed. Darren Blake Investments? The signature below confirmed it. His address printed clearly beneath the company name. His address, the cottage. He read it again, slower this time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. They sat there, calm and polite, confirming what shouldn't be possible. Henry set the letter down on the counter and stared at it. A strange stillness filled the room, the kind that came before a storm. Outside, wind pushed against the windows, the ocean's roar faint in the distance. By habit, he reached for his coat and keys. He didn't bother calling Darren. Some truths were better uncovered in silence. At the county clerk's office, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and damp paper. A young clerk looked up when Henry approached the counter. Afternoon, sir. How can I help you? Henry slid the letter forward. I need to check property filings associated with this address. The clerk typed briskly, the sound of keys clicking sharp in the quiet room. Name? Henry Blake. The clerk hesitated, eyes flicking to the screen. There are a few records here, Mr. Blake, but not all under your name. Henry felt something twist inside him. What do you mean? The man turned the monitor slightly. Looks like some exploratory business filings, LLC applications, zoning interest forms, listed under Darren Blake Investments. Your address is used as the principal office. For a moment, the words didn't register. The numbers, the document codes, the signatures, they blurred into one long betrayal. He cleared his throat. These filings, do they change ownership? The clerk shook his head. Not yet, sir, but they give the impression of intent, like someone positioning the property for development. Happens a lot before real estate pitches. Henry stared at the screen. There it was, in black and white, Darren Blake Investments, principal office, 74 Ocean Cliff Drive, his cottage, his sanctuary. A slow heat began to rise in his chest. Not rage, not yet, but something steadier, heavier. He asked for printed copies and signed the request form with hands that didn't shake. Not here, not in public. Back outside, the sky had turned the color of steel. Rain began as a mist, then thickened into steady drops. Henry drove through it, wipers thudding in rhythm with his thoughts. Darren Blake Investments. He mouthed the words like a bad taste. The man hadn't just disrespected him. He'd used his trust as a tool, his home as leverage. The memory came uninvited. Darren, years earlier, standing in his driveway asking for Emily's hand. Nervous, polished, every word rehearsed. I'll take care of her, Mr. Blake. You have my word. Henry had believed him then, believed that ambition could coexist with integrity. Now, decades of quiet dignity felt mocked by a single careless fraud. As the road curved along the cliffs, the rain blurred the horizon into streaks of gray and silver. The ocean below looked restless, the same way Henry's mind churned, deep currents moving beneath a calm surface. When he pulled into the cottage drive, he didn't go inside right away. He sat behind the wheel, letter and printout spread across the passenger seat, raindrops ticking softly on the roof. His reflection stared back from the window, older, wiser, and for the first time in years, uncertain of the family he'd built. He whispered into the rain, voice low and steady. I gave him trust. Lightning flickered across the horizon, and the whisper hardened into a vow. Let's see what he does with it. Snow had started to fall by the time Henry arrived at Emily's house. The lights glowed warm through the windows, garlands draped along the porch railing, a picture of family peace that didn't quite match the weight in his chest. He carried a small box of gifts, simple things, handmade, like he'd always done. But the familiar joy of the season felt distant this year, muffled beneath the unease that had been building since autumn. Inside, laughter floated from the dining room. The table was set for 6, silverware polished, candles burning low. Emily smiled when she saw him, that same soft smile she'd worn since childhood, though now it came with an edge of worry. "Dad, you made it," she said, hugging him tightly. Her voice trembled just enough for him to notice. Darren appeared behind her, sleeves rolled up, carving knife in hand. "Henry, glad you could join us. We were just about to sit down." His grin was effortless, like nothing between them had changed. They gathered around the table, Emily, Darren, and both sets of parents. Darren's mother, Nora, offered Henry a too-sweet smile across the candles. "We've heard so much about your beautiful cottage," she said. "It must be wonderful living by the ocean." Henry nodded politely, cutting his roast. "It's peaceful," he replied. Conversation buzzed around him, but beneath the polite laughter, tension clung like static. Emily kept glancing between her father and her husband, her fork barely touching her plate. Henry tried to focus on the meal, on the Christmas music playing faintly in the background, on anything but the growing sense that something was about to break. Halfway through dinner, Darren cleared his throat and tapped his glass lightly with his knife. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice smooth and commanding, the tone of a man used to controlling rooms. "Quick announcement before dessert." Henry looked up, fork still in hand. Darren reached for Emily's hand but didn't look at her. "So, after New Year's, my folks will finally be moving into Dad's coastal place. They're thrilled." For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Emily's eyes widened. "Darren," she began, but he kept talking. "They'll only be there for a while, of course," he continued, smiling at his parents, "until their renovation's done. It's perfect timing." Henry's fork froze midair, the silver catching candlelight. Across from him, Nora beamed. "That's so generous of you, Henry. We'll take good care of the place." Emily's voice broke softly. "Darren, you didn't—" Her husband waved her off. "It's already sorted, honey. Everyone benefits." Then came the laughter, small, awkward, the kind people use to cover discomfort. Henry set his fork down carefully, the sound of metal against china sharp in the still air. His voice, when it came, was quiet but deliberate. "Who said they could move in?" Darren looked at him, feigning surprise. "You did, in a way. It's family, Henry. You'll see it's best for everyone." Across the table, Emily's face flushed pale. Her eyes darted between them, wordless apology shimmering in them. Henry took a slow breath, every muscle in his jaw tightening beneath the calm exterior. "Family," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word for the first time. Then he stood, folding his napkin with care, placing it beside his plate. "If you'll excuse me." Nora blinked. "You're leaving already?" Henry offered a thin, polite smile. "Long drive home. Don't want to be caught in the snow." He reached for his coat, nodding once to Emily. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." His voice cracked slightly, but he kept walking, the murmur of confusion and whispers fading behind him. Outside, the cold hit hard. Snowflakes clung to his coat as he crossed the driveway, each step heavier than the last. Through the window, he saw Darren still talking, gesturing with that same confident smile, oblivious to the damage already done. Inside the truck, Henry gripped the steering wheel, his breath fogging the windshield. The Christmas lights from the house glimmered faintly in the mirror, blurring through the glass like ghosts of something once whole. He whispered to no one, "So that's how it is." Then he started the engine, the hum of it steady and low, and drove off into the falling snow, face calm, heart burning quietly beneath it all. The ocean wind was sharp that morning, the kind that cut straight through wool and memory alike. Henry parked by the cottage, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, and took a moment before stepping out. The house looked exactly as he'd left it, the cedar siding, the porch he'd built with his own hands, the windows reflecting the gray sea. But as he walked up the steps, something felt different. Not wrong exactly, but touched. The lock turned easily, almost too easily. Inside, the familiar scent of pine oil and salt had been replaced by something faintly floral, lavender. He froze in the doorway. The hallway light was on. Then he saw them. 3 cardboard boxes stacked neatly against the wall labeled in a tidy cursive, "Nora's Linens." Another smaller box sat beside them, kitchenware. The sight didn't bring rage. It brought something colder, a hollow quiet that began at the ribs and spread outward. He stepped farther inside, scanning every corner like a man inspecting a wound. The furniture had been shifted slightly, his mother's rocking chair angled differently, a vase he didn't own placed near the entry table. He crouched to read the return address on the boxes. Portland. Darren's handwriting on the shipping stickers. His chest tightened. Emily. Henry set the box lid down carefully, as though afraid to damage something that was already broken. He walked through the cottage slowly. Bedroom, kitchen, living room, each space now carrying a shadow of someone else's plan. His sanctuary wasn't waiting anymore. It had been claimed. He reached for the drawer by the sink where he kept the spare keys. The small hook hung empty. A quiet exhale escaped him, not quite a sigh, not quite a curse. He stood there, hand braced on the counter, staring out the window toward the churning water. The gulls screamed overhead, the sound harsh against the stillness inside. It wasn't anger he felt, at least not the kind that shouts. It was something slower, deeper, hurt, aged, and heavy. The kind that came when trust started to rot. He walked through the house again, this time with purpose. Every window latch tested, every door resecured. He replaced the code on the keypad by the back door, pressing each button with calm precision. When he was done, he leaned against the door frame and stared down the empty hallway. It looked different now, not like the home he'd built, but like a stage where someone else had started rehearsing without him. Henry took out his phone and stared at Emily's name. He hesitated for a long moment before pressing call. "Hey, Dad," she answered after a few rings, voice soft, a little uncertain. He didn't waste time. "Did you give them permission to bring things into my house?" Silence. He waited. Seconds stretched. The only sound was the wind pressing against the window panes. Finally, her voice came, small, cracking at the edges. "Dad, I just thought it would make things easier. Darren said they were just storing a few boxes before—" "Before what?" he interrupted, still steady, though his heart felt like it was tightening around each word. "Before they move in?" She didn't answer. He could hear her breathing, could almost picture her standing in her kitchen, hand over her eyes, guilt sinking in. "Emily," he said quietly, "you gave them a key." A soft sound, half sob, half whisper, slipped through the line. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Dad. I just wanted peace." Henry closed his eyes. Peace doesn't come from giving away what isn't yours to give. He let the silence breathe between them, the weight of it filling every inch of the room. Then, gently but firmly, he said, "I'll handle it." "Dad," he ended the call before she could finish. The phone screen dimmed, leaving his reflection faint in the glass. Henry exhaled slowly, feeling both lighter and lonelier than he had in years. The cottage was quiet again, but not the comforting kind. It was the quiet that came after a truth had finally spoken its name. He looked down the hallway one last time, where the boxes waited like trespassers that didn't yet know they'd crossed a line. Then he reached for his coat, his expression calm, but eyes sharp with new resolve. If they wanted to play games in his home, they'd soon learn. He still held the blueprint. The next morning brought a low gray sky and a quiet determination Henry hadn't felt in months. He drove inland, away from the salt and wind, the road slick from overnight rain. In the passenger seat sat a manila folder, deed copies, tax receipts, and a photo of the cottage he'd built plank by plank. He'd stared at that picture over coffee, wondering when a home had become something he needed to protect. His destination was a small brick building at the edge of town, Reed and Warren, attorneys at law. The gold lettering on the door had faded, but the name still carried weight. Inside, the air smelled of paper, old coffee, and trust. "Henry Blake," came a familiar voice. A man in his late 60s stepped out from behind a desk, piled high with case files. "Well, I'll be damned. You still know where to find me." Henry smiled faintly. "I figured if I was going to talk legal trouble, I'd do it with someone who knows I don't start it." The man chuckled. "Fair enough." Bill Warren had been Henry's fishing buddy back when life was simpler, before Claire's illness, before Darren's ambition had started casting long shadows. They shook hands, and the lawyer gestured toward a chair. "What's got you looking like you swallowed a nail?" Henry slid the folder across the desk. "Family," he said simply. Bill raised a brow. "That bad, huh?" Henry leaned back, watching his friend leaf through the papers. "My son-in-law's been poking around my property, using my address for his company filings, sending boxes over without permission. Feels like he's trying to anchor himself where he doesn't belong." Bill nodded slowly, flipping through the documents. "And your title?" "Right here," Henry said. "Been mine free and clear since the rebuild." Bill studied it, lips moving silently as he read. After a moment, he sat back and exhaled. "Well, good news first. The house is yours. Clean title, no encumbrances, no joint claims. He's got no legal footing. But," he added, tapping the folder, "if he's using your property for business registration, he's blurring lines. And blurred lines get messy fast if someone decides to challenge boundaries." Henry frowned. "What kind of messy?" Bill leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "The kind that invites confusion. He can't take it from you, but he can tangle it in paperwork. Investors, filings, potential buyers. It only takes one misunderstanding for something honest to look disputed." Henry's shoulders slumped slightly. "Feels like I'm being pushed into a corner, Bill." "That's what people like him do," the lawyer said gently. "They test how far you'll bend before you stand straight again." He paused, then added, "You could sell, Henry. Walk away clean before it gets complicated." Henry looked up, startled. "Sell it? That feels drastic. That place is—" He trailed off, the image of the ocean cottage flashing through his mind, the wood he'd sanded smooth, the nights he'd sat by the window listening to the sea like an old friend. Bill nodded. "I get it, but boundaries sometimes need paperwork. Selling doesn't mean surrender. It means you control how the story ends. You decide the terms." Henry sat in silence, the rain starting again outside, soft against the windows. For years, he'd solved problems with his hands, broken fences, leaky roofs, splintered wood. This was different. This required patience, not tools. Finally, he said, "If I sell, it'll be on my terms. Quiet, clean, no fanfare." Bill smiled faintly. "That's the Henry I know. Just make sure you move first before anyone else writes their version of this story." Henry nodded, standing. "You'll help me with the paperwork?" "Of course. And Henry," Bill said as he walked him to the door, "don't let guilt slow you down. Doing what's right sometimes looks selfish to the people who benefit from your silence." Henry paused at the threshold, the lawyer's words echoing. By the time he stepped back into the rain, his decision wasn't complete, but something inside him had shifted. The next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be measured. He started the truck, the windshield wipers thudding in rhythm. The ocean waited somewhere beyond the hills, unseen but constant, just like the truth that had finally started to take shape. And in that steady sound of rain, a plan began to form, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. The smell of grilled meat and charcoal drifted through the neighborhood, mixing with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Darren's backyard was alive with chatter, local realtors, investors, and a handful of neighbors mingling under string lights. The whole scene had that polished, curated energy Darren thrived on. Banners fluttered with his company logo, and a cooler full of craft beer sat open like an offering to his success. Henry parked down the street, uninvited, but not unwelcome, at least not yet. Emily had mentioned the little get-together, her voice careful, neutral. "He just wants to celebrate a few new clients," she'd said. Henry had heard enough of Darren's boasting lately to know there'd be more to it than that. He arrived quietly, blending into the crowd like background noise. Nobody noticed the older man by the fence, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, expression unreadable. He watched Darren move through the guests, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, performing confidence. Then he heard it, Darren's voice, amplified by a grin and a half-drunk charm. "We're expanding soon," he said, gesturing toward a slideshow on a tablet someone passed around. "My wife's father has this beautiful ocean property, perfect for what I'm building. We're adding some extra space, maybe even a deck redesign. It's all family property anyway. Just logistics now." Laughter and nods followed. Someone toasted. "Two family deals." Henry's jaw tightened, but he stayed still, just another shadow in the light. Family property. The words rolled over him like gravel. Darren wasn't just crossing lines anymore. He was erasing them. The night stretched on. Guests drifted away one by one until the music faded into low background hum. Only a few empty bottles and dying coals remained. Darren stood near the grill, checking his phone, the glow lighting his smirk. Henry stepped out from the dark corner of the yard. "Quite a crowd," he said. Darren looked up, startled, but masking it quickly. "Henry," he said, half smiling. "Didn't see you there." "I noticed," Henry replied. His tone was calm, too calm. He walked closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. "Heard a bit of your speech. Sounds like you've got big plans." Darren's shoulders squared, his confidence automatic. "You know how business works. Expansion, opportunity, can't sit still forever." "Expansion," Henry repeated quietly. "You're talking about my house, aren't you?" Darren smirked. "Our family's house. You said yourself it's empty most weeks. Why not make use of it? Think of it as the next phase. I'm not asking for charity, Henry. I'm building a future for Emily, for all of us." Henry studied him in the dim light, the younger man's ambition practically vibrating in the air. "You're building something all right," he said softly. "But it's not a future. It's a kingdom on sand." Darren laughed, but there was an edge to it. "You think you can stop me? You can't stand in the way of progress. I've got clients lined up who'd kill for that view. You can't keep it locked away forever." Henry took a step closer, his voice low, even, deliberate. "You think this is about money, Darren, but it's not. It's about respect, and what happens when a man mistakes kindness for weakness." Darren's grin faltered just slightly, though he tried to recover. "You're overreacting. You'll come around once you see how much sense this makes." Henry shook his head. "I don't need to stop you," he said, tone almost tender. "You'll do that yourself." The words hung in the cool air, quiet, but heavy enough to stay long after they stopped speaking. Henry turned, walking toward the gate, the faint orange light from the dying grill reflecting in his eyes. Behind him, Darren called out, "You'll regret pushing me out of this, old man." Henry paused at the gate, not turning around. "You already pushed yourself out," he said, then walked into the night. The drive home was silent, the sound of tires over asphalt steady, measured, like the ticking of a clock counting down. By the time he reached the cottage, the anger had settled into something sharper, not bitterness, not revenge, clarity. He switched on the porch light, looked out toward the sea, and breathed deeply. The line had been drawn tonight, not in anger, but in truth. And for the first time, Henry knew exactly which side he stood on. The next morning, the ocean was calm, too calm, like it knew something was about to shift. Henry sat at the kitchen table, the phone in his hand, Mara Kingston's business card beside his coffee mug. She was a young local realtor he'd met once through the hardware store, sharp and steady, with a reputation for quiet efficiency. He'd been turning the idea over in his mind since the lawyer's office. It felt drastic, yes, but maybe drastic was what the situation demanded. He dialed. "Mara Kingston," came her voice, brisk but friendly. "Henry Blake," he said. "You sold that cottage on Driftwood Lane last summer, didn't you?" "I did," she replied. "Beautiful property. You looking to buy?" "No," Henry said, glancing toward the ocean through the window. "To sell." There was a small pause on the other end. "Yours?" "Yes, but I want it done quietly. No sign out front, no gossip in town. Just a fair price and a clean deal." Something in his tone must have caught her attention, because her voice softened. "Understood. I can come by today if that works for you." "Today's good." By late afternoon, Mara's white SUV pulled into the gravel drive. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, wind tugging strands of hair across her face. "I've heard about this place for years," she said, taking in the weathered shingles, the ocean framed behind the deck. "Didn't realize it was yours." Henry offered a quiet nod. "Built it myself, every nail." They walked the property together. Mara ran her fingers along the railings, tested the doors, peeked through the sunlit kitchen. She moved with the kind of respect Henry appreciated, nothing rushed, nothing careless. "This view alone could sell the place," she said, stepping out onto the deck. "You've got sunset light, clean foundation, modern restoration. I could list this today and have offers by the weekend." Henry studied the waves, his hands resting on the railing. "I'm not looking for fast. I'm looking for quiet." She turned to him, brow slightly furrowed. "You mean off-market?" He nodded. "No listing, no photos, no sign. I just want the right buyer, the kind who appreciates peace." Mara tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "That's unusual. Mind if I ask why?" Henry's gaze didn't leave the horizon. "Let's just say sometimes peace has a price. I'm ready to pay it." Her expression softened. "Understood." She pulled out a pen and a single sheet of paper. "I can run numbers based on what I've seen. You're sitting on a gem, Mr. Blake. I'd recommend a list price of $975,000, maybe higher depending on the market push this quarter." He gave a faint smile. "List it at $950. Quietly, to someone who'll love it, not flip it." She nodded, jotting notes with quick, confident strokes. "Consider it done." The setting sun spilled gold across the porch as they went over the preliminary paperwork. The pen felt heavier than it should have when Henry signed. It wasn't the ink, it was the meaning. Each signature was a boundary rebuilt, a line drawn clean through the noise of manipulation and greed. When they finished, Mara closed the folder and tucked it neatly into her briefcase. "I'll reach out once I find a serious buyer. You have my word. No one will know until it's time." Henry extended his hand. "That's all I ask." Her grip was firm, her smile genuine. "I can see why you love this place," she said. "It feels honest." He chuckled softly. "That's the idea." As her car disappeared down the road, Henry stood alone on the deck. The air was cool, the tide rolling in with a steady rhythm. Inside, the house felt different, lighter, as if it sensed a decision had been made. He picked up the copy of the signed agreement from the counter, folded it once, and slipped it into a drawer. Through the window, the horizon darkened, the first hints of evening rising. Somewhere behind him, fate had already begun to shift gears, quietly, invisibly, turning in his favor. Henry poured himself a cup of tea, his movements unhurried, deliberate. For the first time in months, he didn't feel cornered. He felt composed, in control. And though no one else knew it yet, the game had just changed forever. The cafe was small, the kind of place where time seemed to slow between the hiss of the espresso machine and the hum of quiet conversations. Henry sat at a corner table by the window, his coffee untouched, fingers tracing the rim of the cup. Outside, the gray sky pressed low over town, and rain streaked down the glass like slow tears. He'd chosen this spot deliberately. Neutral ground, public enough to keep tempers contained. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air as he waited, steadying his breath. Emily arrived first. She looked tired, shoulders tense beneath her coat. Her expression caught somewhere between worry and apology. "Dad," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. "You said this was important?" "It is," he replied, voice calm but weighty. "I need you to listen." Darren arrived moments later, his entrance loud enough to turn a few heads. He wore his usual confidence like armor, pressed shirt, phone in hand, that smile too sharp to be sincere. Behind him trailed his mother, Nora, her pearls gleaming even in the gray light. "All right, Henry," Darren said, taking the seat beside Emily. "What's this about? You sounded serious." Henry leaned back, studying each of them in turn. "I won't take much of your time," he said evenly. "I just wanted to tell you all together so there's no confusion later." He paused, eyes settling on Emily, softening just slightly. "I'm simplifying my life. I've decided to sell the cottage." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The sound of milk frothing behind the counter filled the silence. Then came the reaction. Emily blinked. "You're selling it?" Her voice was small, uncertain. Nora frowned. "Surely not before we've even—" But Darren's reaction was instant, explosive. He laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're joking." Henry shook his head. "I'm not." Darren leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing. "You can't. My parents are already packed. We've arranged storage, transport, everything." Henry's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Then unpack." The words landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Emily's hand went to her mouth. Nora shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking. Darren's face flushed. "You can't just make a decision like that without considering us." "Us?" Henry repeated. "Darren, the house was never yours to consider." "That's not the point," Darren snapped. "It's family property. We were counting on—" "It's my property," Henry interrupted, firm but not cruel. "And I'm choosing peace over chaos. That place stopped being a home the day people started treating it like a prize." Emily's eyes glistened. "Dad, please, don't do this because of—" "I'm doing it because of everything," he said gently, turning to her. "Because I want you to have a family that isn't built on resentment. Because I want to sleep at night without wondering who's holding spare keys to my front door." Nora spoke up then, her voice soft but defensive. "We never meant to overstep, Henry. Darren, Henry said, cutting in, has a way of mistaking ambition for entitlement. I've lived long enough to know where that road leads." Darren sat back, jaw tight, a faint tremor in his hand as he tapped the table. "You think you're teaching me a lesson?" he said, his tone low, dangerous. "You'll regret this. You can't shut us out forever." Henry met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not shutting anyone out. I'm just closing a door that was left too far open." The silence that followed stretched thin and taut. Outside, a truck passed, tires hissing through puddles. Inside, the coffee machine hissed again, punctuating the moment like the release of held breath. Emily looked between them, torn in half. Her eyes begged for something, resolution, forgiveness, anything. But Henry's face stayed calm, composed. He'd already made peace with his decision long before this table. Finally, Darren stood. The chair scraped sharply against the tile. "You'll see," he said, voice cold, words trembling with restrained anger. "You think you're in control, but you're not. You just started something you won't be able to stop." He grabbed his coat, motioned to his mother, and stormed out into the drizzle, leaving the bell above the door jangling behind him. Emily sat motionless, staring down at her hands. "Dad," she whispered, "I didn't want it to come to this." Henry reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. "Neither did I," he said quietly, "but sometimes peace needs protecting." She nodded, tears slipping free, silent and slow. Henry waited until she composed herself, then stood, sliding his untouched coffee aside. "You take care of yourself, sweetheart," he said. "And tell Darren, whatever storm he's planning, I've seen worse." He left a few bills on the table and walked out into the rain. The clouds hung low over the town, and as Henry buttoned his coat, he felt the first real calm he'd known in months. Not relief exactly, but certainty. The line was drawn, the choice made, and though the road ahead promised confrontation, he felt ready. Behind him, the cafe door closed with a soft click, an ending and a beginning. The days after the coffee shop meeting passed like heavy weather, quiet but full of pressure, each hour stretched tight between relief and regret. Henry found himself checking his phone more often than he cared to admit, waiting for a call that never came. Emily's name stayed at the top of the screen, unanswered messages beneath it. "Just checking on you, sweetheart. Hope you're okay." Nothing. When she finally did respond, it wasn't with words, but silence, a space too wide to cross. He could imagine her torn between husband and father, guilt gnawing at her in the way only love could make it hurt. Henry didn't blame her, not anymore. He spent those early mornings walking along the shoreline, coffee in hand, boots sinking into wet sand. The sea was rougher now, winter waves folding over each other in endless rhythm. The cottage stood behind him on the bluff, steady against the wind. A home still his. For now. One afternoon, as he sorted through mail, he noticed an envelope with perfect handwriting and a faint perfume that clung to the paper. Nora. He unfolded it slowly. "Dear Henry, I was surprised to hear of your sudden decision. We had expected a gesture of hospitality. Family should feel welcome, not dismissed. Darren is deeply hurt, and I share his confusion. I do hope this misunderstanding resolves soon. Sincerely, Nora Blake." Henry stared at the letter for a long while. It was polite, elegant, and utterly blind to the damage her family had done. He set it down beside the bills and sat quietly, the ticking clock marking each second of restraint. Later that evening, he drafted his reply on thick stationery, the kind Claire used to keep for thank you notes. "Dear Nora, thank you for your letter. I understand expectations can be complicated. I am simplifying my life, as I mentioned to Darren and Emily. Enclosed is the realtor's brochure for the cottage. It will belong to someone new soon, and I wish them peace in it. Warm regards, Henry Blake." He folded the letter, slipped in Mara's glossy brochure, showing the cottage bathed in sunset light, and sealed the envelope. No venom, no anger, just truth delivered gently. The next morning, he dropped it in the postbox outside the hardware store. The air was crisp, bright with frost. As he turned to leave, he nearly bumped into Pastor Reed, bundled in a long wool coat. "Henry," the pastor greeted, smiling through the cold. "Haven't seen you at service lately." "Been busy setting things straight," Henry replied. Reed's gaze drifted toward the cottage up on the hill. "Word travels fast in small towns," he said softly. "Heard there's been some family turbulence." Henry chuckled dryly. "That's one way to put it." The pastor studied him for a moment. "You handled it the right way, Henry. Truth without cruelty. That's courage most people can't manage. Henry nodded, eyes fixed on the ocean in the distance. Didn't feel like courage, felt like survival. Sometimes, Reed said, they're the same thing. They parted with a handshake, and as Henry walked home, he realized the weight on his chest had lightened. Not gone, but bearable. By the weekend, the small town buzzed with whispers. He caught fragments while ordering coffee at the gas station, even in church parking lots. Can you believe it? Sold his place out from under the son-in-law. Guess old Mr. Blake finally had enough. Good for him. Henry didn't correct them. He didn't feed the rumor or defend himself. He simply nodded politely, carried himself with quiet dignity, and went on with his day. The nights were harder. The house felt bigger somehow, the silence heavier without Emily's voice on the other end of the line. He would sit by the window, listening to the hum of the heater and the faraway crash of waves, wondering if peace always came with such loneliness. Yet each morning he rose, made his coffee, and faced the day with steadier hands. He'd done what needed doing. The storm behind him still rumbled in the distance, but the air felt clearer now, sharper, honest. And though no apology had come yet, Henry knew one thing for certain. Truth, once spoken, didn't need to be repeated. It just needed to stand firm. As dusk fell that night, a gull landed on the deck railing, its white feathers catching the dying light. Henry watched it take off again, wings beating against the darkening sky. The house was still his, but soon it wouldn't be. And strangely, that thought didn't hurt anymore. The knock came just after sunset, hard, impatient, echoing through the cottage like a warning shot. Henry set down his mug, steadying himself before walking to the door. Through the window pane, he could see the shape of a man pacing on the porch, jaw clenched, fists tight. Darren. Henry opened the door halfway, cold wind rushing in with the tension. "Evening," he said calmly. "Evening," Darren snapped, stepping forward as if the word itself offended him. "You think you can just sell the place out from under us and still pretend everything's fine?" Henry didn't move. "It's my home, my choice." "You're ruining this family over a deed," Darren spat. His face was flushed, eyes burning with a mix of fury and desperation. "Do you even hear yourself? This isn't business. This is blood." Henry met his glare without flinching. "I'm not ruining anything. I'm saving it from rot." The words hit harder than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Darren stepped closer, voice shaking now. "From rot? You're calling us rot? You've lost it, old man." Henry took a breath, slow and controlled. "No, Darren. I've finally found it. Perspective." Darren laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the quiet. "Perspective? You're too stubborn to see what's right in front of you. I've worked my whole life to build something for Emily, for your granddaughter, and all you do is stand in the way. You think your little moral victories will keep the lights on for anyone." Henry's hands tightened at his sides. "You don't build a future by taking what isn't yours. You build it by earning it." "Spare me the sermon." Darren's tone turned cruel, his words sharp. "You're just jealous you're not needed anymore. The world moved on, Henry. People don't cling to property out of pride. They invest, they leverage, they make something of it. You're holding everyone back." Henry looked at him for a long moment. "You call that progress?" he said softly. "Turning everything sacred into collateral?" Darren's nostrils flared. "You know what I think? You're scared. Scared to be alone. Scared that selling that house won't fix what's already broken inside you." The line crossed something deep. Henry's jaw clenched. "You don't talk to me about fear, son. You wouldn't know it if it stood on your doorstep." "Don't call me son." Darren's voice cracked like a whip. The air thickened between them, both men standing only feet apart, generations of pride and misunderstanding colliding in that narrow hallway. "I gave you trust," Henry said quietly. the restraint in his voice trembling under weight. Not permission. And I gave your daughter a life better than you ever could, Darren shot back. But you can't stand that, can you? That she chose someone who actually moves forward. Henry stepped closer then, not in anger, but with the kind of authority that didn't need volume. I can stand a lot, Darren, but I won't stand for arrogance parading as vision. For a second, silence swallowed them. Only the ticking of the clock filled the space. Then Darren's fist hit the door frame, not at Henry, but near enough that the wood splintered. Fine, Darren hissed. Sell it. Sell your damn house, but don't come crying when your family wants nothing to do with you. Henry didn't flinch. His reply came low, almost kind. That's the thing, Darren. I don't cry anymore. Darren stared at him, eyes glassy, not with remorse, but rage held too long. Then he turned sharply and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound was loud, final. A sharp crack followed, the wood along the hinge splitting clean through. Henry stood there for a long moment, listening to Darren's footsteps fade into the night, the sound of tires spitting gravel as the car roared away. The storm outside had picked up, rain beginning to tap against the windows. He turned slowly to the door, tracing his fingers over the fractured frame. A small splinter broke free and stuck to his palm. He stared at it, then at the damage itself. The crack wasn't large, but it was visible, a scar, not unlike the one running through the family itself. He fetched his toolbox from the closet. It took an hour to realign the hinge, to sand the split edges, to reinforce the wood. The motions were muscle memory, steady, patient, purposeful. When he finished, he stepped back and studied his work. The door would hold. He wiped his hands, exhaled deeply, and turned off the porch light. The cottage was quiet again, but it wasn't emptiness he felt this time. It was solemnity. The kind that followed truth, finally spoken aloud. Pastor Reed's words from earlier echoed faintly in his head. Truth without cruelty, that's courage. Henry locked the door gently, almost reverently, the repaired hinge clicking back into place. The silence that followed didn't feel lonely. It felt earned, sacred. He walked to the window, watching the storm sweep over the ocean, the wind bending the grass, flat against the earth. There would be more conflict ahead. He could feel it in his bones. But for the first time in a long time, the house, like its owner, stood unshaken. Henry heard the knock long before he opened the door. It wasn't the pounding kind Darren used, the one fueled by ego and frustration. This one was softer, hesitant, as if the person behind it wasn't sure they deserved to be there. He opened the door and found Emily standing on the porch, wrapped in her wool coat, eyes rimmed red from crying or sleeplessness, or both. Her hair was tied back in a rush, and her hands trembled slightly as she held them together. "Dad," she said, voice low, tired. Henry didn't say anything at first. He just stepped aside. "Come in." The warmth of the cottage met her like a memory. She moved slowly through the doorway, glancing around as though seeing it for the first time again. The faint smell of cedar and salt lingered in the air, the same as when she was a child. She took a deep breath, her voice barely steady. "He's ashamed," she said finally, "but he won't say it." Henry poured 2 mugs of tea, the steam curling in the cold morning light. "Darren?" Emily nodded, her eyes downcast. "He knows he crossed a line. But he can't admit it, not out loud, not even to me. He's angry at himself, I think, but too proud to face it." Henry handed her a mug and sat across from her at the table. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, sad, full of things that didn't need saying. He studied her face, the way the years had added worry where laughter used to be. "You look tired," he said gently. She gave a weak laugh. "I am. I feel like I've been holding my breath for months." Henry nodded. "That's what guilt does. It holds you in place until you decide to start breathing again." Her lip quivered, and she looked up at him. You should hate me, Dad. I let it happen. I gave them the key. I didn't stop him when I should have. He shook his head. Hate's a waste of space in a small heart like mine. You made a mistake. That's not betrayal. That's being human. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away, her fingers tightening around the mug. After a moment, Henry stood and gestured toward the door. Come on. She frowned. Where? The beach. They walked in silence down the familiar path behind the cottage. The tide was low, and the sand stretched wide and empty, the sky a soft, overcast gray. The air bit at their cheeks, the sound of gulls echoing in the distance. Henry's pace was slow, deliberate. You remember this spot? He asked. Emily nodded, smiling faintly through her tears. Of course, you taught me to fish right over there. I was 8. I caught a crab instead of a trout. And you screamed like it was a monster, he said, chuckling. Your mother almost fell over laughing. Emily laughed too, the sound fragile but real. Then her expression sobered again. Mom would have known what to do about all this. She always could talk him down. Your mother had a gift, Henry said softly, but she also had a rule. Never let kindness be confused with weakness. That's one I forgot for a while. They stopped near the edge of the surf. The waves rolled in gentle arcs, touching the tips of their boots before retreating. Henry looked at the water for a long time before speaking again. A home's not inheritance, he said finally. It's example. What you build, how you protect it, how you let it go when it's time. That's what you leave behind. Emily turned toward him, tears streaking down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered, for all of it. I thought I was keeping the peace, but I was just afraid of breaking it. Henry opened his arms, and she stepped into them. Her face pressed against his coat. He held her close, the way he used to when she was small, his hand resting against the back of her head. The sound of the ocean filled the quiet, a rhythm older than either of them. He didn't tell her it was okay. Some things didn't need words. They just needed time and forgiveness to settle like sand after a storm. When they finally stepped apart, Emily looked lighter somehow, her eyes red but softer. What happens now? She asked. Henry looked out toward the horizon, where the clouds were beginning to thin, a pale band of light breaking through. Now? He said. We keep walking forward, one honest step at a time. They stood there together, the tide creeping closer, wind tugging gently at their coats. And for the first time in months, Henry didn't feel like a man defending something. He felt like a father, rebuilding something worth keeping. The path back to the cottage waited behind them, footprints fresh in the wet sand, the waves already reaching to wash them clean. The morning the buyers arrived, the sky over the Oregon coast looked like brushed steel, cold, calm, and waiting. Henry had risen early, tidied the cottage, and opened the curtains wide so the light could find its way in. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the sea air drifting through the cracked window. He heard the tires on gravel before he saw them, a modest sedan pulling into the drive, followed by Mara's white SUV. She stepped out first, clipboard in hand, her usual professional calm edged with quiet excitement. Morning, Mr. Blake, she called, her voice carrying easily over the wind. I think you'll like this couple. Henry smiled faintly, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets. You've said that before, Mara, but this time I'll take your word for it. The couple climbed out of their car, a young man and woman, both in their late 20s. They looked slightly nervous, the way people do when stepping into something they've dreamed about for too long. The woman rested her hand on her stomach as they approached. Mr. Blake, Mara said, introducing them. This is Jordan and Leah Hayes. They're expecting their first child in March. Leah's smile was shy, luminous. It's beautiful here, she said immediately, glancing toward the ocean visible through the trees. Even more than in the photos. Jordan extended a hand, firm but humble. Thank you for letting us see it on such short notice. Henry nodded. It's no trouble. Come on in. Place doesn't need selling. It'll do that on its own. Inside, they moved through the rooms quietly, reverently. Leah paused at the window seat overlooking the sea, running her fingers over the smooth wood Henry had carved himself. It feels alive, she said softly, like someone built it with heart, not just hands. Henry smiled, his throat tightening a little. That's exactly what I hoped someone would notice. Jordan studied the stone fireplace, the carefully restored beams. You did all this work yourself? Every inch, Henry said. After my wife passed, I needed something steady, so I built this place. Guess it ended up steadying me, too. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The quiet in the cottage wasn't awkward. It was sacred, the kind that fills spaces when everyone senses something honest. Mara broke it gently. They've been looking for months, she said, turning to Henry. Every house they've seen has been too loud, too polished. They want something simple, somewhere to start right. Leah nodded, eyes bright. Somewhere we can raise our child with peace around them. Henry felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt since the first time he finished this house, and stepped back to look at it whole, warmth, completion. He watched them wander into the kitchen, already talking softly about where a crib might fit, where they could hang photos, where laughter might live. It wasn't greed in their eyes. It was gratitude. When Mara finally turned to him with that knowing look, Henry didn't hesitate. What's the offer? He asked. She smiled. Full asking price, no contingencies. They want to move as soon as you're ready. Henry let out a slow breath, nodding. All right then. All right? Mara asked, eyebrows raised. He gave a small laugh. You sound surprised. I am, she said. Most sellers need a night to think. Henry looked around the cottage one last time, the worn floorboards, the sunlight spilling across the dining table, the faint hum of the sea through open windows. I've been thinking about this for months, he said. Just didn't realize I was waiting for the right people. Mara opened her briefcase, pulling out the contract. We can sign preliminary paperwork today, then finalize closing after the holidays. Henry nodded. New Year's Day, he said after a pause. Mara glanced up. You sure? Offices might be closed. Doesn't matter, Henry said. It's symbolic. Fresh year, clean slate. Mara smiled. That's poetic, Mr. Blake. He shrugged lightly. Poetry's just truth that learned how to breathe. They moved through the paperwork slowly. The pen felt warm in his hand, heavier than any hammer he'd ever swung. Each signature drew a line between what had been and what was next. When it was done, Mara gathered the papers neatly, her expression soft. Congratulations, she said. Leah stepped forward, eyes glistening. Thank you, she whispered. We'll take care of it, I promise. Henry managed a smile, his voice quiet but certain. That's all I need to hear. They left just before dusk, the couple waving from their car as they drove down the hill. Mara lingered a moment, giving Henry a nod before following. When the sound of the engines faded, the only thing left was the wind, and the house, still standing proud against it. He walked through the rooms one last time, fingertips grazing the walls, the door frames, the small imperfections he'd left on purpose. Every mark had a story. Every scar meant something. By the window, he paused. The ocean was dark now, silver moonlight catching the edges of the waves. He could almost see Claire there, smiling, approving, the quiet ghost of everything good he'd ever built. Henry whispered, "It's time." He didn't mean it with sadness. It was release. Back at the table, the signed contract lay neatly stacked. He folded his copy, slipped it into a drawer beside an old photograph of Emily, as a little girl holding her first fishing rod. The house creaked softly, the wind brushing against it like a farewell. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt no anger, no bitterness, just stillness. Outside, the waves kept moving as they always had, endless and unburdened. Fate had turned quietly, as if it had been waiting for him to step aside and let it. He turned off the lights, stood in the dark a moment longer, then whispered to the empty room, "You're ready for someone new." And for the first time since his wife's passing, Henry Blake smiled, not because of what he'd built, but because he was finally ready to let it go. The last week of December settled over the coast like a slow exhale, gray mornings, cold afternoons, nights where the tide climbed higher than usual. Inside the cottage, Henry moved through each room with a quiet purpose. The decision was made, the contract signed, the future already set in ink. Now came the smaller work, the kind that required patience, memory, and goodbye. He packed his life carefully. Not as a man escaping, but as one who understood the dignity of leaving something right. Each box carried a piece of him. The old fishing reels, the books Claire had loved, the photo of Emily on her 10th birthday holding a trout, almost as long as her arm. He labeled them neatly, his handwriting steady despite the ache in his chest. Outside, wind hissed through the cracks in the siding, rattling the windows like a reminder. It's time. Across town, Darren was in motion too. Word traveled easily in small places. A contractor friend of Mara's mentioned seeing Darren at a hardware store, loading up boxes of supplies and bragging about renovations scheduled for early January. January 2nd, he'd said confidently. Once the holidays are done, we'll be moving in for good. Emily had overheard the call. She'd tried to speak up, the words catching in her throat. "Darren," she'd said quietly, "maybe you should check with Dad first." But Darren waved her off, his certainty absolute. "Trust me, Emily. He'll come around. He always does." Only this time, he wouldn't. Back at the cottage, Henry stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the empty spaces where his life had once been. Pictures removed from the walls, shelves bare, the quiet echoing in a way that didn't feel lonely anymore, just complete. He loaded the last of the boxes into his truck, then turned to the furniture that wouldn't fit. Instead of selling it, he called the local shelter, asking if they could use a few solid chairs, a dining table, and a bed frame. When the volunteers came, he helped them carry each piece to their van, joking softly, his tone calm and warm. One of the younger men, maybe 25, paused at the door. "You sure you don't want to keep anything, sir? This place has a good spirit to it." Henry smiled faintly. "That's why I'm letting it go. A good spirit deserves to keep moving." When the van drove away, he went back inside for one last walkthrough. The air was still, salt-heavy, full of endings. In the kitchen, he paused by the refrigerator, its hum steady and familiar. He took a scrap of paper from the counter, tore it neatly, and wrote a single line in his firm, carpenter's script. Every story needs its lesson. He pinned it to the door with a small magnet shaped like a lighthouse, Claire's favorite, and stepped back. The note looked simple enough, but the meaning underneath ran deep. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even warning. It was truth, left plainly where it could be found by whoever cared to understand it. He grabbed his coat, took one last glance around, then reached for the light switch. The soft click echoed through the hollow space. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing waves hard against the rocks below. The ocean had always been his companion, unforgiving, constant, honest. As he closed the front door behind him, he ran a hand along the wood, feeling every groove, every imperfection he'd once sanded smooth. "Thank you," he murmured to it, a quiet farewell between builder and home. The engine of the old truck rumbled to life. Headlights cut through the fog, glinting off the mailbox that still bore his name. As he drove down the narrow coastal road, the cottage grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it was just a shape against the horizon. He didn't look back again. The wind came in strong off the sea, carrying the scent of salt and rain, sweeping through the open cab of the truck. It felt like a hand at his back, not pushing, just guiding. By the time he reached the main road, the first drops of rain began to fall. Henry rolled down the window, letting the cold air sting his face. There was no anger left now, no fear, just a deep, earned peace, the kind that only comes after a man's done the hardest thing of all, letting go. The road curved inland, the cottage disappearing completely from view. Behind him, the ocean roared like applause. January 2nd dawned pale and still, the kind of winter morning when the ocean looked like metal, and the gulls cried as if sensing something broken in the air. Down the coastal road, a U-Haul truck lumbered around the bend, its orange sides flashing against the cliffs. Darren sat behind the wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon, jaw tight, knuckles white around the steering wheel. Beside him, Emily stared out the window, her face drawn, silent. In the rearview mirror, she could see his parents' car following close behind, its trunk crammed full of boxes labeled guest linens and kitchen. He hadn't spoken much during the drive, just small bursts of forced confidence, like a man trying to convince himself the plan still made sense. "Dad'll come around," he muttered once. "You'll see. He'll thank me when this all settles." But Emily hadn't answered. She'd stopped trying to correct him weeks ago. Her silence had become its own confession. When the convoy finally pulled up to the cottage, Nora and her husband, Alan, climbed eagerly from their car, bundled in scarves and smiles. "Oh, Darren, it's lovely," Nora exclaimed, already stretching her neck to see the ocean through the trees. "I can't believe we'll wake up to that view every morning." Emily stepped out slowly, heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, the air too still, the property too quiet. Darren walked up the path, swagger in his step, fishing for the spare key Emily had given him months ago. He glanced back at his parents and grinned. "Told you it was perfect. Just needs a little life in it again." The key slid into the lock, then stopped halfway. It wouldn't turn. He tried again, harder this time. The metal scraped, but the door didn't budge. "What on earth?" Darren muttered. He pulled it out, examined it, then pushed it in again. Still nothing. Emily stepped forward, voice tentative. Maybe he changed the locks." Darren ignored her. He tried the knob, locked solid. "No," he said firmly. "No, he wouldn't do that. He's just being dramatic." Behind him, Nora and Alan stood on the porch, arms full of bags, their smiles fading. "Is something wrong with the key, dear?" Nora asked. Darren forced a laugh. "Probably just rusted from the sea air. Happens all the time." He turned to his wife. "You've got your copy, right?" Emily swallowed hard. "Darren." "What?" Before she could answer, the front door opened. A young woman stood there, startled but polite. She wore a loose sweater and had the faint glow of early pregnancy. Behind her, a man appeared, taller, protective, his hand resting gently at her back. "Can we help you?" the man asked. Darren froze. For a moment, words failed him. We're supposed to be moving in today," he said finally, gesturing toward the truck. "This is my father-in-law's property." The young woman frowned. "Mr. Blake? No, he sold this house. We closed on it last week." Nora blinked, confusion overtaking her face. "Sold?" The man nodded. "We're the new owners. I'm Jordan. This is my wife, Leah. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Darren's mind spun, disbelief curdling into anger. That can't be right. There must be some mistake. Jordan pulled out a folded document from his back pocket and held it up. "No mistake. Here's the deed. It's ours now." Emily's breath caught. Her worst fear had just unfolded in front of everyone she loved and everyone who'd ignored her warnings. Darren turned away from the couple, his face red, phone already in his hand. "Unbelievable," he muttered, punching in Henry's number. Henry answered on the second ring. His tone was calm, almost serene. "Morning, Darren." Don't mourning me, Darren snapped. You sold the house without telling anyone? My parents are standing on the porch right now with boxes in their hands. I told you I was simplifying my life, Henry said evenly. You just didn't believe me. Darren's voice rose. You blindsided us. Henry cut him off gently. No, son, I just acted before you could. There was silence on the line, except for the sound of wind and waves in the background on Henry's end. Then, finally, he added, That house wasn't mine to lend. The words landed with the finality of a door closing. Darren stood frozen on the porch, phone still to his ear. Behind him, his parents shifted uncomfortably, murmuring apologies to the bewildered young couple now standing in their doorway. Emily turned away, tears welling in her eyes. Henry's voice came one last time, calm but unshakable. Take your family home, Darren. It's time to start over. Then the line went dead. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ocean below, relentless and sure. Darren stared at the locked door, as if it might still open out of mercy. But it didn't. The key dangled uselessly from his hand before he let it fall into the sand at his feet. Emily placed a trembling hand on his arm, but he pulled away, walking back toward the truck, jaw clenched, pride shattered. His parents followed quietly, their excitement turned to quiet embarrassment. As the U-Haul rumbled back down the narrow road, Emily looked over her shoulder one last time. Through the window of the cottage, she could see Leah and Jordan standing together, framed by warm light, their hands clasped. The house looked alive again, just not for them. And far away, in a small diner overlooking the sea, Henry Blake finished his coffee, set a few bills on the counter, and looked out at the horizon. He didn't smile, but his eyes held peace. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of the ocean across the glass, steady, final, and free. By the end of that week, the story had traveled farther than the wind off the coast. In a town as small as Seacliff Bay, secrets never stayed buried long, especially when they involved money, property, and pride. It started as whispers at the coffee shop, spread through the real estate office, and by Friday, it was front-page gossip. Local realtor miscalculates family deal, loses property to surprise sale. The headline wasn't cruel, but it didn't need to be. Everyone already knew the details. At the Marina Cafe, Darren's name was mentioned between sips of coffee and sideways glances. Arrogant move, someone muttered. Thought he could outsmart the old man. At the grocery store, two women whispered near the produce aisle. He used his father-in-law's address for company filings. Who does that? Even the barbershop joined in. Guess he learned real estate's about trust, not leverage. For a man whose business ran on reputation, it was a slow public unraveling. By the second week of January, two of Darren's biggest clients, both longtime property investors, had quietly backed out of pending deals. His assistant quit. Calls went unanswered. A project he'd been boasting about on social media vanished overnight, deleted in a flurry of damage control. In his office, the once bustling space had gone still. The plaques on the wall looked like they belonged to someone else. He sat at his desk with the blinds drawn, replaying every conversation he'd had with Henry in his head. The arrogance, the certainty, the way he'd spoken as though ownership were a birthright instead of something earned. He didn't realize Emily was standing in the doorway until she spoke. You didn't even tell me the deals fell through, she said softly. Darren looked up, eyes rimmed red. I didn't think it mattered anymore. It matters, she said, stepping into the room. It always mattered. You just didn't see it until it was gone. He pushed the stack of papers aside, the sound sharp in the silence. So what? You're here to say, I told you so? She shook her head. No, I'm here to tell you I'm done. He blinked. Done? With this, she said, gesturing around the office. With the company. I can't keep pretending this is about family when it's always been about control. Emily, you can't just... I already accepted a job, she said, cutting him off. Different firm, smaller, quieter. It feels honest. Darren leaned back, the words hitting harder than he expected. So that's it. You're walking away. I'm not walking away, she said. I'm walking forward. She left before he could answer. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty office like a gavel. Outside, the winter wind carried salt from the ocean and the faint sound of construction, other people's projects moving forward while his stood still. Darren sank into his chair, staring at his reflection in the black glass of his computer monitor. For the first time in years, he saw himself clearly, not as the confident businessman, but as a man who'd mistaken entitlement for ambition. Across town, Henry lived quietly. He'd kept to himself since the sale, avoiding gossip, avoiding the temptation to gloat. The townspeople treated him differently now, not out of pity, but respect. When he walked into the diner or the hardware store, people nodded first, a silent acknowledgement of the line he'd drawn and how he'd stood by it. One afternoon, as he paid for a cup of coffee, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Henry." He turned. Nora stood there, bundled in her wool coat, her usual poise softened by something fragile, humility. "Could we talk a moment?" she asked. He gestured to the booth by the window, and they sat. She folded her gloved hands, eyes down. "I owe you an apology," she began. "When Darren first mentioned the idea of moving in, I didn't see the harm. I thought it was family helping family. I see now how blind that was. You were kind when you didn't have to be." Henry took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it down. "You don't owe me anything, Nora." "Yes, I do," she said quickly, "because what happened, what Darren did, reflected on all of us. I let it happen. I didn't ask questions, and I'm sorry." The cafe had grown quieter around them. People pretended not to listen, but the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Henry nodded once, steady and kind. "Apology accepted," he said. Then after a pause, he added, "Lesson learned." Nora exhaled shakily, relief softening her face. "You're a better man than most." He smiled faintly. "No. Just older. Time teaches what pride won't." She left him then, and as she passed through the door, the few customers who had overheard the conversation gave Henry small nods of respect, not because he'd won, but because he hadn't gloated. He'd chosen grace when it would have been easier to revel in vindication. That evening, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, Henry walked the beach near his cottage one last time. The new owner's laughter drifted faintly from the porch, carried by the wind. It didn't sting. It sounded right, like closure carried on the tide. He bent to pick up a smooth stone and turned it in his palm before tossing it into the surf. The ripple spread, fading into calm water. Somewhere inland, Darren sat alone in his office, staring at the phone, considering a call he didn't yet have the courage to make. And Henry, miles away, felt the world quiet around him, the kind of quiet that follows truth finally settling into place. The storm had passed, but the echoes remained, not bitter, just true. The town would forget the scandal eventually, but it wouldn't forget the lesson. By mid-January, the story had become impossible to contain. In a small coastal town like Seacliff Bay, gossip traveled faster than wind over water. It started with whispers at the cafe and grew into conversations at the grocery store, the church parking lot, the hardware counter. Everyone knew the outline. A proud realtor who overreached, tried to leverage his father-in-law's house for personal gain, and got caught in his own web. The details blurred with every retelling, but the lesson stayed sharp. Greed has a way of humbling itself. The headline appeared in the Seacliff Beacon 3 days later. Local realtor's deal collapses after family dispute. The article was polite, even restrained, but the damage didn't need bold letters. Darren Blake's reputation, once a gleaming badge of confidence, now carried the dull weight of embarrassment. His colleagues stopped answering calls. Clients reconsidered pending contracts. Investors withdrew quietly, citing market hesitation. In truth, no one wanted to be associated with arrogance dressed as ambition. Darren tried to push through the silence, showing up to the office early, calling contacts who now spoke in clipped tones. But every time he left the house, he felt the air shift. The nods from neighbors had turned to pitying half-smiles. The coffee shop he used to hold meetings in seemed to quiet whenever he entered. It wasn't cruelty, it was worse than that. It was disappointment. Emily watched him unravel with the weary clarity of someone who'd seen the storm coming long before the thunder. She spent her mornings in another room, avoiding the sound of his phone ringing to voicemail, his sighs stretching longer with each unanswered call. One evening, she stood in the doorway of his office. The blinds were half closed, the computer screen reflecting his face in a blue, tired light. He hadn't shaved in days. "You need to stop," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "Stop what?" "Pretending this is just bad luck." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What do you want me to say, Emily? That I made a mistake? Fine. I made a mistake. There. Happy?" She shook her head slowly. "No, Darren. I'd be happy if you meant it." His eyes flashed irritation, then softened. "You think I'm not ashamed? You think I like being the fool in every conversation in town?" "I think," she said carefully, "you still believe this was something that happened to you. It wasn't. You did this. To Dad. To us." Darren looked away, jaw tightening. "He sold that house to humiliate me." Emily's voice lowered. "No, he sold it to save himself. Maybe to save us too." Silence stretched between them. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere outside, a gull cried over the wind. She took a deep breath. "I'm leaving the firm." He blinked. "You're what?" "I got a job offer in Tillamook. Small agency. Honest work. No shortcuts." "You're quitting me?" "I'm quitting the man this job turned you into." Her voice cracked, but she didn't waver. "If we're going to have any chance left, it has to start away from all this." He stared at her for a long moment, then turned toward the window. The reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. "I just wanted to give you more," he said quietly. "You gave me less by forgetting who you were," she replied, and left without looking back. The next morning, Henry Blake sat at his usual booth in the Harbor Diner, sipping black coffee. The regulars greeted him with quiet nods. Not deference, not gossip, respect. The story had reached everyone, but no one dared tease him about it. He'd handled the situation not with vengeance, but with grace, and that left people humbled. The doorbell chimed. When Henry looked up, he saw Nora Blake, Darren's mother, standing hesitantly near the counter, clutching her purse. She approached his table slowly. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "may I sit for a moment?" He gestured to the seat across from him. "Of course." She sat, folding her gloves neatly in her lap. "I owe you an apology," she began. "I thought I understood what family meant. I thought helping Darren was loyalty. But I see now I was helping him dig a hole he couldn't climb out of." Henry stirred his coffee, letting the spoon rest against the cup. "We all mistake enabling for kindness sometimes," he said. Her eyes welled. "You didn't deserve what we did, the presumption, the intrusion. You showed restraint where most men would have shown revenge." Henry gave a faint, steady smile. "Lesson learned," he said simply. She nodded, relief softening her face. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for." "No," he said, standing slowly. "Just a man who finally stopped confusing peace with silence." When she left, the room seemed lighter. A few customers who'd overheard nodded his way. Henry returned to his coffee, calm in a way that felt new. That evening, he walked along the shoreline near his cabin, the sky streaked pink and gold. The new owners of the cottage, Leah and Jordan, were out on the deck, stringing soft yellow lights. Their laughter drifted through the sea breeze, not haunting, but healing. Henry smiled faintly. The house had life again, the right kind. Meanwhile, inland, Darren sat alone in his office, the light fading fast. His phone lay on the desk, Henry's number glowing on the screen. His thumb hovered over it, trembling, before he finally set it down. He wasn't ready, not yet. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like the beginning of understanding. And miles away, standing in the salt wind, Henry looked out over the darkening waves and whispered to no one, "Truth always floats, even after the storm." The tide answered with a quiet crash, steady and sure, like closure wrapped in forgiveness. The weeks that followed were quieter, stripped of noise and pretense. Darren and Emily moved into a small rental on the edge of town, a modest two-bedroom with uneven floors and paint that needed touching up. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and for the first time in years, there were no investors, no contracts, no borrowed pride echoing through its walls. The hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the porch steps became the only sounds they needed to measure peace. The first nights were awkward. The air carried an invisible tension, as if the ghosts of old arguments still lingered in corners. Darren slept light, often staring at the ceiling, his thoughts looping back to what he'd lost. Not just the house, but the version of himself that had believed success meant control. Emily tried not to fill the silence. She cooked simple meals, played soft music, and let the quiet do what words couldn't. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink, not through apologies, but through small acts of living. Every Thursday afternoon, Sophie came to visit her grandfather. Henry would meet her at the end of the driveway, his weathered hands ready to catch the little girl as she ran full speed toward him. "Grandpa!" she'd shout, her laughter slicing through the coastal wind. It was a sound that restored something in him every time. Inside Henry's workshop, sawdust floated like soft snow. The old tools still gleamed under sunlight streaming through the window. Sophie's eyes always widened as she took it all in. "Can I help today?" she'd ask, tugging at his sleeve. "You can always help," Henry would say, handing her a small block of cedar. "But remember, measure twice, cut once." She repeated the phrase carefully, as if it were a secret spell. Together, they sanded and shaped pieces of wood, their laughter echoing through the shop. Henry taught her how to hold a hammer properly, how to listen to the grain of the wood before cutting. "The wood tells you what it wants to be," he said one afternoon. "You just have to be patient enough to hear it." From the doorway, Emily often watched, quiet, smiling, a mug of coffee in hand. There was something profoundly healing in seeing her father and daughter together, two generations bridged by rhythm and patience. Henry didn't talk much about the past. He didn't need to. His lessons weren't spoken. They were built, one plank at a time. Darren started joining them after a few weeks. At first, he lingered near the doorway, awkward and silent, hands shoved into his pockets. Henry didn't comment, didn't push. He simply continued working, letting the sound of tools and the steady beat of progress fill the gaps where pride once lived. One afternoon, Sophie handed her father a piece of sandpaper. "You can help Grandpa," she said cheerfully. "He lets me sand the easy parts." Darren took it hesitantly, meeting Henry's gaze for the first time in weeks. Henry nodded once, wordless permission granted. Side by side, they worked in silence, the scrape of sandpaper against wood the only conversation they needed. As the light faded, Henry brushed off his hands and looked at the small stool they'd built together. It wasn't perfect. One leg sat slightly uneven, but it stood, solid enough to hold. Sophie grinned. "It's beautiful," Henry smiled, pride quiet and deep. "Not bad for a family project." Emily's eyes glistened. She saw something shifting, something fragile but real. Darren looked at the stool too, then at his daughter, and finally at Henry. "You were right," he said softly. "About everything." Henry shook his head. "No, son. You figured it out yourself. That's the only way lessons stick." The evening air turned cool as they stepped outside. The ocean murmured in the distance, steady and patient. Sophie ran ahead toward the truck, her laughter trailing behind her like a ribbon. Henry watched them go, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of completion that didn't come from winning, but from mending. As the sun sank behind the trees, he turned back toward his workshop, the scent of cedar still hanging in the air. The tools waited where he'd left them, lined in quiet order. Healing, he realized, didn't come from words or apologies. It came from the work, steady, repetitive, honest labor that turned regret into understanding. He smiled faintly, closing the door behind him. The light inside the shop flickered once, then steadied, like the rhythm of a heart learning, at last, to trust again. The mornings had grown still again. January was fading into February, and the sea outside Henry's cabin had settled into a softer rhythm, less storm, more breath. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and salt. On the kitchen table sat his leather-bound journal, worn smooth at the corners, pages yellowed from years of notes. He hadn't written in weeks, not since the sale. But that morning, with sunlight spilling across the wood, he opened to a blank page and began to write slowly, the words forming as if from deep within his bones. Possession ends where understanding begins. He paused, reading it back. It felt right, like the kind of truth you only earned after losing something that was never truly yours to keep. He kept writing. "I used to think home meant ownership, walls you built, floors you walked, memories nailed into beams. But maybe it isn't about keeping. Maybe it's about caring, long enough to pass it forward without resentment. Maybe that's the difference between holding on and holding hostage." He set the pen down and rubbed his thumb over the paper, feeling the groove of each letter. The cottage, the conflict, the storm. All of it had been part of something larger, a lesson, one that had cost him comfort but bought him peace. He closed the journal gently and looked toward the window. Outside, the sky was a blaze of gold, the ocean mirroring fire. Sunset was coming, and with it, the familiar pull of the beach, the place where all his thinking seemed to land. Henry slipped on his coat, grabbed his walking stick, and stepped outside. The wind met him immediately, brisk but kind, carrying the cry of gulls and the distant crash of waves. The sand gave under his boots as he made his way toward the waterline, each step syncing with the rhythm of the sea. The horizon burned orange, streaked with lavender clouds. The world felt wide again, uncluttered by names, paperwork, or pride. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt small in the best possible way. He walked until his legs began to ache, until the noise in his head quieted completely. Then something caught his eye, a seashell half buried near the edge of the surf. He bent down slowly, brushing sand from its surface. It was shaped like a heart. Not perfect, one side cracked, the color uneven, but unmistakably a heart. He turned it over in his palm, smiling. "Well, Claire," he murmured, "you always said the sea had a sense of humor." The tide reached his boots, cool and insistent, and for a brief second, he thought about leaving it there, to let the ocean keep its secret. But then he slipped it into his pocket instead. Some reminders, he figured, were worth carrying, not because they held pain, but because they held proof. Proof that he'd learned when to let go and when to hold on. Back at the cabin, he lit a small fire and set the shell on the windowsill where it caught the fading light. The flames danced quietly, their reflection shimmering in the glass. He brewed a cup of tea and sank into his chair, the quiet wrapping around him like an old friend. The phone buzzed once on the table, a text from Mara. "Thought you'd like this." Attached was a photo. The cottage, His cottage stood under the same sunset he'd just watched, the porch lights glowing warm against the darkening sky. Leah stood on the deck, one hand on her rounded belly. Jordan knelt beside her, painting the rail with steady care. A string of soft lights hung between the beams. The place looked alive again, loved, inhabited, honest. Henry stared at the photo for a long time, a slow smile spreading across his face. The ache that came with it wasn't grief anymore. It was gratitude, the kind that humbled more than it hurt. He typed a short reply. "Looks perfect. Tell them to keep loving it well." Then he set the phone down and leaned back, eyes drifting to the fire. The house he'd built was no longer his, but the peace inside it somehow still belonged to him. It lived on through laughter he'd never hear, and through walls that would outlast every argument he'd ever had. The clock ticked softly. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows, like the ocean itself exhaling. Henry reached for his journal again and added one final line beneath his earlier words. "Peace isn't what you find after the storm. It's what you build because of it." He closed the book, blew out the lamp, and let the fire's last glow fade into the dark. The heart-shaped shell caught the final glimmer of light before night took the room completely. For the first time in years, Henry didn't feel the pull of the past. Only stillness, only grace. And as the waves rolled steady outside, that peace, quiet, earned, and real, finally took root for good. The smell of fresh lumber filled the church parking lot as morning sun spilled through the stained glass windows of St. Luke's. Henry wiped his palms on his jeans and adjusted the brim of his cap, eyeing the stack of 2x4s beside the youth center wall. The old building had seen better days. The paint flaked, the porch sagged, and the floors creaked like they were tired of waiting for help. He'd been volunteering there for 2 weeks, lending his hands to something that didn't belong to him, yet felt close to home. It was good work. Honest work, the kind that kept the heart busy while the mind settled. He lifted his hammer and set to framing the new ramp by the entrance, his rhythm steady, the sound echoing through the cool air. With every swing, he felt a kind of therapy that no sermon could offer. That's when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Need a hand?" Henry froze, his grip tightening on the handle. Slowly, he turned. Darren stood a few feet away, sleeves rolled up, tool belt hanging awkwardly on his hip, like he wasn't sure he had the right to wear it. There was no arrogance in his stance this time, just quiet uncertainty. Henry studied him for a long second, then nodded toward the stack of boards. "There's a saw on the table. Measure twice, cut once." A faint smile touched Darren's face. "I remember." They didn't say much after that. The only conversation came from the rhythm of tools, saws humming, hammers striking, wood meeting purpose again. The sound was rough but good, like two men rebuilding something neither had the courage to name. Pastor Reed moved between volunteers, clipboard in hand, but paused when he saw the two Blakes working side by side. He didn't speak, just watched, an approving glint behind his glasses. Then he murmured to one of the helpers, "Redemption is repetition done right." By mid-morning, sweat dotted Darren's forehead. His movements were slow but deliberate, each one careful, almost reverent. Henry caught himself watching, surprised at how naturally the younger man fell into rhythm. There was no tension now, just a quiet effort shared between them, like two pieces of wood finely cut to fit. When they broke for lunch, the crew gathered around folding tables set up beneath the maple trees. Someone passed out sandwiches and coffee. The wind carried the scent of sawdust and bread, mingling into something that felt wholesome, simple. Darren sat across from Henry, eyes fixed on his cup. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Darren cleared his throat. "I didn't come here to make anything awkward." Henry looked up from his sandwich, meeting his gaze. "You didn't." Darren paused, searching for the right words. I needed to do something that wasn't about me, something that didn't end in a sale or a pitch. Henry took a sip of coffee before answering. That's a good place to start. A silence stretched between them, not heavy this time, but open, the kind that invited air instead of suffocating it. You still building birdhouses with Sophie? Darren asked, almost smiling. Every Saturday, Henry said. She's got her own hammer now, pink handle. That earned the first real laugh from Darren in months. She told me she's better at sanding than me. She's not wrong, Henry replied, grinning. They both laughed then, softly but genuinely, the kind of laughter that chipped away at months of distance. Pastor Reed wandered by, his old work gloves slung over one shoulder. You two building a ramp or a bridge? He asked with a knowing smirk. Both, Henry said. The pastor chuckled, tapping his clipboard. Good answer. The afternoon stretched long and warm. Together, they finished the ramp, sealed the edges, and painted the railing white. When the last coat dried, Darren stepped back and admired the clean lines. It's sturdy, he said. Almost looks new. Henry nodded. Things usually do when you fix what's underneath first. Darren glanced sideways. You mean forgiveness? Henry shrugged. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night. By the time they packed up, the sun was dipping low, washing the town in that golden light that made everything look gentler. Darren helped Henry load the last of the tools into his truck, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable, just familiar. As they stood there, Henry reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a small photo, a snapshot of the cottage Leah and Jordan had sent weeks ago, their baby now born, smiling in Leah's arms. Darren looked at it quietly. They look happy. They are, Henry said. That house got what it needed. Darren hesitated, then asked softly, Do you ever regret it? Henry looked toward the church, its new ramp catching the last light. Not once. Some things are meant to pass through us, not stay with us. Darren nodded, his eyes lowering in thought. Guess people are the same way. Sometimes, Henry said, but not always. Some we're supposed to keep, just better than we did before. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of the ocean in the distance. Darren extended his hand. Thank you for not giving up on me. Henry shook it, firm and steady. You're still a work in progress. We both are. They stood like that for a moment, two men bound by family, flaws, and the long work of redemption. Then Darren smiled faintly. See you tomorrow, Dad. Henry nodded, climbing into his truck. Don't be late. We've got more boards to replace. As he drove away, the church lights flickered on behind him, illuminating the ramp they'd built together. Clean lines, sturdy frame, fresh paint. Redemption, it seemed, didn't come in grand gestures. It came in small restorations, done by hand, plank by plank. And for the first time in years, Henry Blake felt the foundation holding firm beneath him again. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the small house, weaving through every room like a quiet memory of home. Emily moved between the kitchen and dining table, arranging the dishes with the same care her mother once had. Linen folded neatly, candles flickering in glass jars, plates mismatched but warm. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. It was the first time in years she'd hosted a family dinner that didn't carry tension like an uninvited guest. Henry arrived early, carrying a small wooden box under his arm. Inside were hand-carved napkin rings he'd made with Sophie in his workshop, each one sanded smooth and tied with a strand of twine. You've outdone yourself, sweetheart, he said as he set them down. Looks like something out of a magazine. Emily smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Don't start, Dad. It's just dinner. He studied her for a moment, his eyes soft. No, it's more than that. It's a beginning. Before she could answer, headlights flashed through the window. Darren's truck pulled into the driveway, and Henry could hear Sophie's laughter spill from the back seat. She was singing some off-key holiday tune as Darren opened her door. "Grandpa!" she shouted, running inside before anyone else could get a word out. She wrapped herself around Henry's legs, beaming up at him. "Mom let me pick the music tonight. I practiced the piano all week." Henry chuckled, kneeling to meet her gaze. "Then I hope you saved my favorite song." "I did," she whispered. "Mom says it's your turn to smile again." Darren entered behind her, shoulders slightly hunched but face open, humbled. He carried a bottle of wine, his expression both grateful and uncertain. "Evening, Henry," he said quietly. Henry nodded. "Glad you came." Nora arrived a few minutes later, balancing a steaming pie in her hands. "It's apple," she said, almost nervously. "Old recipe. Thought I'd try redeeming myself with something sweet." Henry smiled. Redemption tastes better with cinnamon. That earned a small laugh from her, the kind that loosened the air in the room. Dinner began awkwardly. Small talk about the weather, Sophie's piano lessons, the renovation at the church, but it softened with each passing minute. The clinking of silverware filled the pauses. The food was simple but comforting, the kind of meal that didn't need perfection to mean something. Halfway through, Darren stood, glass in hand. His voice trembled slightly, but the words came clear. "I've made a lot of mistakes this year," he began, "and I spent a long time trying to justify them. But truth is, I was wrong. I thought I was building a future when I was just tearing apart the present." Emily looked at him, eyes glistening. Henry stayed still, his fork resting on his plate. Darren turned toward him. "So, tonight, I want to thank you for saving us from ourselves, for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." The room went silent, except for the faint hum of Sophie's little tune under her breath. Henry set his glass down and stood slowly. "Well," he said with a half smile, "it's about time someone else gave the speech." Laughter rippled softly around the table, easing what tension remained. Nora dabbed at her eyes. "We should make this a tradition," she said. "Less fighting, more pie." "Speaking of pie," Henry said, nodding toward the dessert, "I believe we've got something worth cutting." As plates were passed and coffee poured, Sophie climbed onto the small piano bench near the window. She began to play the first few notes of Silent Night, her small fingers pressing carefully on each key. The melody was uneven, full of childlike stops and starts, but it was beautiful, pure and imperfect, like forgiveness itself. Henry stood behind her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. The candles flickered, their light catching the reflection of every face in the room, each softened, each human again. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Henry exhaled, long and deep, and said, "You know, I think your grandmother would have liked this night." Emily reached across the table, taking his hand. "She would have loved it," she said. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of sea air. Inside, the warmth held. For the first time in years, there was no hidden resentment, no sharp words waiting to rise, only laughter, pie, and the quiet grace of a family learning how to breathe again. As Henry looked around the table, at Darren's tired but genuine smile, at Emily's eyes bright with relief, at Sophie humming softly to herself, he felt the weight he'd carried for so long finally lift. It wasn't victory, it was peace, and it was enough. The morning sun spilled through the curtains of Henry's cabin, warm and clean, the kind of light that carried the quiet promise of something new. On the table beside his coffee sat a small white envelope, unmarked, folded neatly, weighted by intention more than paper. He'd looked at it a dozen times already, reading and rereading the lines inside until they felt etched into his bones. Today was the day. He loaded his old thermos into the truck, the envelope tucked safely into his jacket pocket, and drove through the winding coastal road toward town. It was a Saturday, crisp and bright, with the ocean glinting silver at the horizon. The kind of day that made everything, even the past, feel a little more forgiving. Emily had invited him to lunch. Nothing fancy, she'd said over the phone, just the three of us. Her tone had been calm, hopeful, almost shy. He knew what that tone meant. The world had steadied enough for rebuilding. When Henry arrived, Sophie greeted him first, barreling down the steps of their small rental, with a grin that could undo years of worry. "Grandpa," she shouted, holding up a small wooden birdhouse she'd painted herself. "Look, just like yours." He crouched to her level, smiling. "That's perfect. You even left room for the wind to sing through." Emily came to the door, wiping her hands on a towel. Darren followed behind her, nervous, quiet, sleeves rolled up. There was no swagger now, just humility in his movements. "Dad," Emily said warmly, "come in. We made sandwiches. Nothing gourmet." "Good," Henry said with a grin. "I never trusted a lunch that needed silverware." They sat together at the small wooden table. The conversation drifted easily at first. Sophie's new school project, the youth center ramp, the way the seagulls had gotten too bold near the marina. Henry listened, smiling in that quiet way that comes from peace earned the hard way. After they finished eating, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed the envelope on the table between them. Darren looked at it, then at him, uncertain. "What's this?" he asked. Henry leaned back in his chair. "Something I've been thinking about for a while." Darren hesitated before sliding it open. Inside was a single-page lease agreement, simple, straightforward, with Darren's name already typed at the top. The address belonged to a small fixer-upper on the edge of town, a forgotten property Henry had quietly purchased years earlier and used for storage. "It's a lease?" Darren asked slowly, scanning the page. Henry nodded. "A fair one. The rent's low enough to manage, but high enough to mean something. It's not a gift. It's a start." Darren blinked, the words catching in his throat. "Henry, I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything yet," Henry replied gently. "Just do better with it than I did when I gave you too much too soon." Emily's hand flew to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. She looked between them, emotion thick in her voice. "Dad, you didn't have to." "I did," Henry interrupted softly. "Not because you need it, but because you earned the chance to build again. You two have been working for it." Piece by piece. Darren stared at the lease again, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "I don't deserve this." "No one ever does," Henry said with a half smile. "Deserving's overrated. What matters is what you do once you're trusted again." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Darren stood, slow and deliberate, and crossed to where Henry sat. His voice was unsteady when he spoke. "You've done more for me than I ever did to earn your forgiveness." Henry looked up at him, eyes clear. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you build, like a house, patiently, one nail at a time." Darren nodded, the weight of the past years settling into something manageable. Emily rose and wrapped her arms around her father, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Thank you." Henry hugged her back, steady and sure. "Just promise me one thing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Build it with patience this time. No shortcuts, no schemes, just work and heart." Darren met his gaze across the table. "You have my word." Henry smiled faintly. "Good. Then I'll help you lay the first plank." Outside, the afternoon sun brightened the yard, spilling through the window and across the table where the envelope still sat, a symbol of something mended, not a transaction, but a turning point. Sophie ran past the window, chasing her shadow in the golden light, her laughter carrying through the air like the sound of renewal itself. Inside, 3 people sat quietly, not in regret or apology, but in the soft space where new beginnings take root. Henry reached for his cup of coffee, savoring its warmth. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "every circle has to close before a new one starts." Emily smiled through her tears. "Then I guess we're finally starting again." Henry nodded, eyes on the sunlight glinting off the lease between them. "Yes," he said softly, "and this time, we'll build it right." Snow had returned to Seacliff Bay, soft and steady, like the town was being rewritten in white. Every rooftop wore a smooth layer of silence. Every tree bowed under its delicate weight. Henry drove slowly along the narrow coastal road, the heater humming against the cold. The sky was pale and endless, and for the first time in years, he wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. He had received the invitation a few days earlier, handwritten in neat cursive, signed by Leah and Jordan. "We'd love for you to stop by for tea. The nursery's finished, and we wanted you to see it before the baby arrives." The words had stirred something quiet inside him. Gratitude, maybe, or just the strange warmth that came from seeing the next chapter play out where his had once ended. When he reached the cottage, he almost didn't recognize it. The old shingles had been replaced, the porch railing freshly painted, the front door now a deep, welcoming blue. A string of white lights glowed along the eaves, their reflection shimmering faintly in the snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, the same one he'd patched himself years ago. Leah opened the door before he could knock, cheeks flushed from the fire inside. "Mr. Blake," she said brightly, "come in. Please, you must be freezing." Henry smiled, stomping snow from his boots. "Just Henry," he said. "I'm nobody's landlord anymore." The warmth hit him as soon as he stepped inside. The scent of cinnamon, pine, and something sweet baking in the oven. The house looked both familiar and transformed. The furniture was different, the walls lighter, but the heartbeat of the place was the same. Laughter, care, life. Jordan appeared from the kitchen, a mug of tea in each hand. "Glad you made it," he said. "We've been meaning to show you what we've done with the nursery." Henry followed them down the hallway he'd once walked every evening, back when it echoed with his own footsteps in solitude. Now, it was filled with photographs, sunlight through open curtains, Leah holding her rounded belly, Jordan standing in front of the cottage, grinning like a man who understood what roots meant. The nursery was soft and bright, pale yellow walls. A wooden crib near the window, a mobile of tiny stars hanging from the ceiling, a quilt folded neatly on the rocking chair. The room radiated hope, the quiet, steady kind that didn't need to announce itself. Leah touched the edge of the crib gently. "We tried to keep some of the woodwork you did," she said. "Jordan refinished it, but the bones are yours." Henry's throat tightened, though he smiled through it. "Good bones last," he said softly. "Just needed the right hands to care for them." Leah turned, eyes shining. "You gave us more than a house, you know. You gave us a place to start." Henry looked around one last time, the sunlight spilling across the crib and floorboards he once sanded. "No," he said. "You built that yourselves. I just left room for it to happen." They insisted he stay for tea. They talked about small things, the coming baby, the winter storms, the town's Christmas market. Henry listened, content to let their joy fill the space. It didn't sting anymore. It felt right. The house had outlived its old story. That was the point all along. When it came time to leave, Leah pressed a wrapped parcel into his hands. "Just something small," she said, "for the workshop." He didn't open it, just smiled, touched by the gesture. "You keep making it a home," he said at the door. "That's all the thanks I need." The snow was still falling, heavier now, soft flakes catching on his coat as he stepped onto the path. He glanced back once, saw Jordan's arm around Leah, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched from the doorway. Warm light framed them, and for a moment, Henry felt like he was looking through time itself, at what letting go was meant to create. He walked toward his truck slowly, boots crunching through the snow. The world was quiet except for the rhythmic sweep of wind against the trees. As he reached the road, he noticed movement a few houses down. A man stood near a wooden fence, hammer in hand, patching a loose plank that had come free in the storm. Darren. Henry stopped for a moment, the cold air sharp in his lungs. Darren looked up, caught his father-in-law's gaze, and straightened. There was no awkwardness this time, no shadow of shame, just calm recognition. Henry raised a gloved hand in greeting. Darren returned the gesture with a nod and a faint, quiet smile. No words, none needed. The snow thickened between them, blurring edges, softening everything it touched. Henry climbed into his truck and sat for a long moment, watching Darren resume his work, steady, measured, patient. He started the engine and turned onto the road, the tires crunching softly beneath him. As he drove away, the glow of the cottage lights faded into the distance, replaced by the vast stillness of winter. He smiled to himself, feeling a peace that didn't come from possession, but from witnessing what had endured. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering old wounds, old footprints, even the fences that divided and connected. And somewhere behind him, father and son kept their silent understanding, held together not by apology, but by quiet respect, the kind that doesn't need words to last. The ocean was calm that evening, its waves moving like slow breath beneath a copper sky. Henry sat at his workbench by the cabin window, the last of the sunlight spilling across the page in front of him. The room was quiet except for the creak of the chair and the gentle ticking of the old clock Claire had chosen decades ago. He had written letters to her before, on birthdays, anniversaries, nights when the silence pressed too heavy against the walls. But this one felt different. It wasn't grief anymore that pulled the words from him. It was gratitude. He dipped the pen into ink and began slowly, carefully, like a man carving truth into wood. "My dear Claire," he wrote, "it's been a long time since I tried to tell you anything new. I suppose I've been too busy trying to live what you always knew." He paused, listening to the wind move through the pines outside. Then his hand steadied again. "They finally understand what we taught. Emily's heart has settled. She sees what love looks like when it's quiet, not loud. Darren's learning how to build things that last, with his hands, not just his will. Sophie's laughter sounds like yours did when she plays, and me. Well, I think I've finally learned that holding on too tightly isn't love. It's fear, dressed up like devotion." He stopped there, exhaling slowly. The pen trembled in his hand, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from release. "You were right," he continued. "Letting go built everything." He looked at the words for a long time, then folded the page neatly, the way she used to fold notes into his lunchbox when they were young. He slid it into a small wooden box made from driftwood, pieces he'd gathered over the years from the same beach where they once walked, hand in hand. The lid closed with a soft click, final but peaceful. Henry stood and shrugged into his coat. The sky outside was streaked in shades of rose and gold, the sun lowering itself slowly into the horizon. He carried the box with both hands as he made his way down the narrow path toward the water. The sand was cold beneath his boots, crunching lightly where the frost clung. When he reached the shoreline, he stopped. The tide was coming in, steady and sure, carrying the soft hiss of eternity with it. He knelt and placed the driftwood box at the edge of the surf. "Take good care of her," he murmured to the sea, voice barely above the wind. The next wave rolled forward, lifted the box, and began to pull it away, gentle at first, then stronger, until it was carried fully into the current. Henry watched it drift farther and farther, the little piece of his past floating toward the fading sun. Above him, a cluster of seagulls circled, their cries rising and falling like a hymn. For a moment, he imagined Claire among them, free, light, watching him with that same patient smile she'd always worn when he was too stubborn to see what mattered most. The sky deepened into amber, and then to violet, the last light glinting off the waves like shards of memory. Henry stood still, letting the wind wash through him. There was no ache left now, only stillness, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for more. He closed his eyes and whispered into the wind, "We did it, Claire. We got them home." The sea answered with the soft crash of another wave against the shore. The gulls wheeled once more, then scattered into the open sky. Henry turned back toward his cabin, footsteps slow, leaving shallow prints in the sand that the tide would soon erase. Behind him, the ocean carried his words out to where light met horizon, where love and loss became the same language. The sun dipped below the edge of the world, glowing like a blessing. And as the day faded to dusk, Henry Blake felt something he hadn't felt in decades: complete. Spring had returned to Seacliff Bay with the smell of rain and sawdust in the air. The frost had melted, the trees were greening again, and everywhere Henry looked, the world seemed to be rebuilding itself. It felt right that Emily and Darren were doing the same. Their small fixer-upper sat at the edge of town, tucked between tall pines and a narrow gravel road. When Henry's truck pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon sun was sliding through the branches, setting everything aglow. The place looked different now, painted soft gray with white trim, a new porch stretching across the front. It wasn't polished yet, but it had character. Honest work had a way of showing itself. Emily stepped out first, her hands still dusted with paint. "You made it," she said, grinning wide. Henry climbed out of the truck and looked around, nodding with approval. "Looks like you've been busy." "Every weekend since February," she said proudly. "Dad, you wouldn't believe how much this place needed." Darren appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, his shirt streaked with plaster dust. "Hey, Henry," he said, voice steady but humble. "Thanks for coming." Henry gave a small smile. "Wouldn't miss it. Heard there was craftsmanship worth seeing." Darren laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "Well, craftsmanship might be generous, but we've learned a thing or two about patience." "Then you're already ahead of most builders," Henry said. They led him inside. The floors creaked a little underfoot, but the scent of fresh paint and new lumber filled the space. The living room walls were patched and sanded, the kitchen counters newly installed. It was a house still mid-transformation, but every nail, every brushstroke spoke of effort, not shortcuts. Emily guided him through each room like a tour guide, pointing out the beams Darren had replaced, the shelves she'd stained herself, the small table they'd restored from the rental. "We wanted to make it ours," she said, brushing her hand against the wood. Henry ran his palm over the smooth edge, smiling. "It shows," he said quietly. "This is what I meant by building slow. Letting things earn their beauty." They stepped out onto the porch, where a pot of coffee steamed beside two chipped mugs. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth. Sophie played in the yard, chasing a paper kite that danced against the bright sky. Darren poured the coffee, his movements steady, deliberate. "We wanted you to see it now," he said, "before it's finished, before it's perfect." "Perfect's overrated," Henry replied, taking a sip. "You don't need perfect, you need proud." Darren looked at him, eyes softening. "I owe you for this," he said, "for giving me another chance." Henry shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You built this with your own hands. That's the only kind of inheritance worth passing on." Emily smiled through quiet tears. "Mom would have loved this place," she said. Henry nodded, his gaze drifting toward the garden plot they'd started beside the fence. "Your mother believed in second chances," he said softly. "I guess we all needed one." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that spoke louder than any apology. Sophie's laughter carried across the yard as the wind tugged her kite higher into the blue. Darren leaned on the porch rail beside Henry. "You were right about pride," he said. "The kind that's earned doesn't weigh as much." Henry turned, eyes glinting with quiet humor. That's because pride's best when shared. Darren laughed, nodding. Guess I'll share some of the next coat of paint with you then. Henry chuckled, taking another slow sip of coffee. You get the walls done right. I'll bring the sandwiches. They stood there together, watching the light fade behind the trees, the sound of hammers from nearby homes echoing faintly through the valley. It was the sound of renewal, the slow, deliberate rhythm of lives being put back together. For years, Henry had thought legacy was something you left behind. But now, looking at his daughter's home, messy, imperfect, full of laughter, he realized legacy was something you built while you were still here, one small repair at a time. He set his cup down and turned toward them both. Keep at it, he said softly. Homes like this, families like this, they only stand if you keep working on them. Darren nodded. We will. Henry smiled. Good. Then maybe next time I'll bring my tools. As evening settled and the air cooled, they lingered on the porch. 3 generations bound not by old wounds, but by the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The light dimmed, but the warmth stayed. New foundations, steady and sure, had finally been laid. The smell of coffee and newsprint filled Henry's cabin that morning, the kind of scent that felt both ordinary and monumental. The Seacliff beacon lay open on the table beside his untouched toast. Across the front page, above the fold, in clean black letters, the headline read, Man who sold his house, rebuilt his family. Beneath it was a photo of him standing outside the church youth center, hammer in hand, a faint smile on his weathered face. The reporter had caught him mid-laugh, just as Pastor Reed had said something that made the volunteers chuckle. It wasn't staged, and maybe that's why it hit him so hard. It looked content. Henry sighed and folded the paper closed, shaking his head. They make it sound like I built the ark, he muttered to himself. When he walked into town later that morning, people greeted him differently, not with gossip, not with pity, but with warmth that carried weight. Mrs. Talbot from the hardware store waved from behind the counter. Saw the paper, Henry. You've become our local celebrity. He grinned faintly. Guess the town's running low on heroes. Nonsense, she said. We just needed one that reminded us what decency looks like. At the post office, someone had pinned the article to the bulletin board, right between a lost dog flyer and an ad for piano lessons. Scrawled across it in blue ink was a single word, respect. Henry stared at it longer than he meant to, his heart tight in his chest. It wasn't pride he felt. It was something humbler, deeper, like seeing your reflection in water and realizing you'd stopped flinching at what you saw. That afternoon, he stopped by the church. The youth center was buzzing again, hammers clanging, paint rollers squeaking, kids laughing as they worked. Darren was there too, helping install a new set of shelves. He nodded at Henry as he walked in, a quiet acknowledgement between equals. Pastor Reed approached from behind a row of paint cans, smiling broadly. Well, well, the man of the hour, he said. Paper got your good side. Henry groaned. I told them not to print it. They twisted half the story. Of course they did, the pastor said with a chuckle. That's what papers do, but they got the spirit right. Henry leaned against the doorway, watching a group of teenagers sanding the window trim. I didn't do anything special, he said. I just stopped pretending peace would build itself. Reed nodded slowly. That's exactly why it's special. You didn't punish. You taught. Henry looked down at his calloused hands, at the faint scars that lined them like a road map of everything he'd lived through. Funny thing about teaching, he said. Half the time, you end up being the one who learns. Reed smiled, eyes glinting with approval. Lessons mutual, then. They stood there together for a while, watching the kids work. The youth center smelled of new paint and fresh lumber, a scent Henry had always associated with starting over. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. Later that evening, he stopped at the diner for coffee. The regulars were already there, reading their own copies of the Beacon. One man tipped his hat. "Didn't know we had a philosopher among us," he said good-naturedly. Henry smiled. "I'm no philosopher, just an old carpenter who ran out of excuses." Laughter circled the counter, gentle and knowing. The waitress poured him a refill without asking. "You should be proud," she said softly. "You didn't just rebuild a house, you rebuilt a family." Henry stirred his coffee, his voice low. "A family's not something you rebuild. It's something you remember how to hold." When he left the diner, dusk had settled over the town. The streetlights flickered on one by one, their glow reflecting off puddles from an earlier rain. In the window of the bookstore, the same newspaper article was taped beside a sign that read, "Good men still exist." Henry stood for a moment, taking it in. He wasn't used to being seen this way, not as a man who'd been wronged, but as one who'd risen quietly, choosing grace over bitterness. It felt right. He started walking toward his truck, hands in his pockets, the evening chill brushing against his face. In the distance, the sound of laughter spilled from Emily and Darren's porch. Sophie's voice carried above the rest, bright and unbroken. Henry smiled, shaking his head as he unlocked the truck door. "Guess they finally got the headline right," he murmured. "Man rebuilds what matters." As he climbed in and started the engine, he glanced once more toward the glowing windows of his family's home. Faith, he realized, didn't always live in churches or books. Sometimes it lived in sawdust, in laughter, in the quiet act of trying again. And as the headlights swept across the winding road ahead, Henry drove into the night with a heart steady enough to carry it all. The sea breeze carried the scent of kettle corn and salt through Seacliff Bay as the annual coastal festival came alive once more. For the first time in years, the town's square was strung with lights, laughter, and music. Booths lined the streets, handmade crafts, local art, the smell of grilled fish mingling with the sweetness of caramel apples. It was the kind of small-town celebration that seemed to stitch a community back together every spring. Henry stood behind the booth marked Blake and Family, Woodcrafts and Restorations. The sign was Sophie's idea, painted in cheerful blue letters. He couldn't help but smile as she arranged her small carvings on the table, tiny sailboats, seashells, and a wooden whale that still smelled faintly of cedar. Emily handed out pamphlets for the youth center fundraiser, chatting with neighbors, her laughter easy and warm. Darren worked beside Henry, steady and focused, helping a customer select a handmade frame. The three of them moved in rhythm, no tension, no unspoken weight, just quiet cooperation. It wasn't lost on anyone walking by. People stopped to comment, to smile, to nod in approval. "Didn't think I'd see you two sharing a booth," one man joked. Darren chuckled good-naturedly. "Neither did we," he said, "but turns out teamwork's good for business and peace of mind." Henry grinned, sanding the edge of a small wooden box. "And it keeps me from talking too much." The crowd laughed, and the moment lingered with warmth that didn't need explanation. As afternoon turned to evening, the sky began to blush orange and pink over the bay. The festival stage was set up near the boardwalk, where children gathered with crafts and projects for the awards ceremony. Sophie's entry sat proudly among them, a small wooden sculpture shaped like an open hand cradling a seashell. She'd spent weeks in Henry's workshop carving it, tongue pressed in concentration, sawdust in her hair. She'd called it the Keeper. When her name was announced, Sophie gasped, eyes wide. "Grandpa, I won!" Henry laughed, helping her up the steps to the stage as applause rippled through the crowd. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. Darren clapped, beaming with pride. Sophie stood at the microphone, clutching her ribbon, her voice small but clear. "My grandpa taught me how to listen to the wood," she said. "He says if you're patient, it tells you what it wants to be." Laughter and applause rose again, warm and heartfelt. Henry's eyes shimmered as he leaned toward Emily and whispered, "She's the best of us." Emily slipped her arm around his, whispering back, "She's all of us." The sun slipped lower, the sea reflecting streaks of molten gold. The festival lights flickered on, and the air filled with chatter and music. Darren handed Henry a cup of coffee, and they stood together by the booth, watching Sophie show her sculpture to a group of curious onlookers. "Guess she's got your hands," Darren said softly. Henry nodded, smiling. "Maybe, but she's got your heart." They both laughed quietly at that, the sound lost in the noise of the crowd, but not in meaning. As the first firework cracked across the sky, everyone looked up, faces glowing in bursts of color. Red, blue, gold, reflected in wide eyes and smiling mouths. The explosions echoed across the water, their shimmer mirrored in the dark waves. Sophie climbed onto Henry's shoulders, giggling as another firework burst overhead. Emily and Darren stood side by side, their fingers brushing, their laughter carried by the wind. For a moment, time felt still. The family that had fractured now stood whole under the same sky. Not perfect, not finished, but together. Henry glanced upward, watching the sparks fade into the night. He felt the echo of Claire beside him, the warmth of her presence in the wind, in Sophie's laughter, in everything that had survived. The fireworks continued, painting the sky in fleeting brilliance. Applause, laughter, belonging, the music of redemption. And as the final explosion bloomed over the ocean, Henry whispered to himself, voice soft but certain, "We built it right this time." The evening settled over the pines like a soft blanket, the kind of dusk that didn't ask for conversation. Henry sat on the porch of his modest new cabin, a mug of coffee cooling beside him, the boards creaking under the slow tap of his boot. The air smelled of cedar and rain-soaked earth. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean murmured like an old friend who never needed to raise its voice to be heard. On the small table next to him sat a postcard, its corners bent, the handwriting neat and familiar. It was from Leah and Jordan, the couple who now owned his old cottage. The picture on the front showed the shoreline in full summer bloom, the same stretch of beach he used to walk every morning. He turned it over and read again, though he'd already memorized the words. Henry. "We think of you every time the light hits the water. The house feels alive, full of laughter and warmth. Thank you for building something that keeps giving. With love and gratitude, the Brennans." He smiled faintly, running his thumb along the edge. The ink had bled just slightly, as if even the words had absorbed a little salt air. He reached for his pen and pulled a blank postcard from the small drawer near the porch rail. The surface was smooth and empty, waiting. His handwriting came slow but sure, letters slanting with the weight of years. "Keep loving it well," he wrote. "That's all any house ever asks." He set the card aside to dry, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The day had been long but gentle. He'd spent the afternoon fixing a loose shutter, splitting firewood, and listening to the rhythm of the world carrying on. From the old radio by the door, a familiar tune began to play. A love song from the 1970s, one he and Claire used to dance to in their kitchen when Emily was small. The melody was scratchy through the speakers, but it filled the space around him like the presence of something eternal. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, the lyrics whispering about time, about holding on and letting go. It didn't make him sad anymore. If anything, it made him grateful to have had love that lasted long enough to echo. The stars began to appear, one by one, scattered across the indigo sky. The porch light flickered softly against the dark, painting the world in shades of amber and memory. Henry reached for his coffee, now cold, and took a sip anyway. The bitterness suited him. It was honest. The phone buzzed beside him. Emily's name glowed across the screen. He answered with a smile already in his voice. "Hey, sweetheart." "Dinner's ready, Dad," she said. "Darren grilled. Sophie made dessert. You better get here before she eats half of it herself." He chuckled. "You sure I'm not intruding on family time?" "You are family time," she replied. "Now get moving before the food's cold." "On my way," he said softly. He slipped the postcard into its envelope, placed it on the rail to mail in the morning, and rose from the chair. His knees ached a little, but it was the good kind of ache. The reminder of work done, of years lived fully. Before stepping off the porch, he looked back once more. The radio was still playing, the love song fading into the crackle of static. The stars were brighter now, their reflections trembling faintly on the hood of his old truck. Henry picked up his coat and keys, pausing as he reached for the door. "Good night, Claire," he murmured under his breath, almost like a prayer. The wind answered with a soft sigh through the trees. Moments later, the truck's headlights flared to life, cutting through the darkness as gravel crunched beneath the tires. He drove slowly down the winding road toward Emily's house, where the glow of dinner lights waited in the window. Steady, warm, forgiving. As the music from the porch faded behind him, Henry felt an ease so complete it bordered on sacred. The road curved ahead, lined with the quiet grace of everything he'd built, lost, and reclaimed. Serenity, at last, wasn't something he chased. It was something he'd arrived at. The kitchen was filled with laughter, the kind that hummed, not shouted. Emily moved easily between the stove and the table. Darren uncorked a bottle of wine, and Sophie set out mismatched plates that clinked against one another in rhythm. The camera lingered on small things, hands passing bread, soft glances shared across the table, the flicker of candlelight dancing against familiar faces. Henry sat at the head, not because he demanded it, but because everyone had silently agreed that's where he belonged. His plate was already half full, though he hadn't touched it yet. He just watched. The sound of forks against porcelain, Sophie's bursts of laughter, the way Emily's eyes softened every time she looked at her husband. It was all enough. Henry's narration begins, calm and reflective, layered over the ambient sound of dinner. "Some houses hold memories," his voice says. "Others teach them." The image fades into a soft montage. Henry standing in the doorway of his old cottage, the wind carrying curtains like ghosts of gentler days. A younger Emily running down the beach with her mother, her laughter lost in the tide. The same door years later, Darren knocking for the first time, the start of something neither of them understood yet. The montage continues, quietly, without words. Henry signing the sale papers. The pen hesitating just before the ink meets paper, the moment of release. Then flashes of reconciliation. Darren at the youth center, paint flecked across his arms. Emily laughing through tears at the family dinner. Sophie carving her little wooden sculpture under Henry's patient gaze. The music swells, soft piano, slow and reverent. The scene returns to the present. At the table, Sophie raises her glass of sparkling cider and says with theatrical flair, "To Grandpa, the best builder in Seacliff Bay." Everyone laughs, glasses clinking. Henry grins, eyes creased at the corners. "You sure about that? I've seen your father use a hammer." Darren feigns offense, holding up his hand. "Hey now, I've learned a thing or two." Henry chuckles, voice low and sheer. "Yeah, you learned the most important thing, how to fix what matters." The room quiets slightly, not from discomfort, but because everyone feels the weight of that truth. Emily reaches across the table, resting her hand over Henry's. "You fixed all of us, Dad." Henry shakes his head. "No, sweetheart, you fixed yourselves. I just cleared the sawdust." The laughter returns, soft and genuine. The camera pans slowly across each face, Emily glowing in the candlelight, Darren relaxed and sure, Sophie giggling as she sneaks an extra cookie. Henry's narration resumes. "There was a time I thought a man's worth was measured by what he could hold on to, his land, his house, his work. But the truth is, the real building starts when you let go of what you thought you needed." The image fades to the ocean at sunset. The same stretch of beach that had once carried his pain now gleams gold under the dying light. Waves roll slow and deliberate, erasing footprints only to leave the sand smooth again. Henry walks along the shore, older now, but unburdened. The wind lifts his collar. The tide pulls softly at the hem of his jeans. He bends down to pick up a piece of driftwood, then tosses it gently into the surf. Funny thing, his voice continues. I didn't lose a home. I built a family. The camera follows the piece of driftwood as it's carried by the waves, turning end over end until it vanishes into the horizon. Flashbacks ripple through again, quick but tender. Emily hugging him after the first sale announcement. Darren's quiet apology over the church ramp, the moment Henry placed the lease in his son-in-law's hand. Sophie's laughter under the fireworks. The music swells once more, strings now joining the piano, filling the air like light breaking through fog. Henry's voice softens. Maybe that's what love really is, building something that doesn't need to belong to you to last. Cut back to the dinner table. Sophie's fallen asleep against Emily's shoulder, the candle nearly burned down. Darren gathers dishes, and Henry helps him without being asked. Their movements are wordless but synchronized, a rhythm learned through forgiveness. As the family clears the table, the scene slows, the sound fading under the hum of music. The final shot returns to the ocean. The tide moves in again, covering footprints one by one. The camera lingers as the foam retreats, leaving the sand smooth, untouched, eternal. Henry's final words echo softly over the scene, spoken with a calm that feels earned. We spend our lives building walls, thinking they'll keep the world out. But sometimes, if we're lucky, they fall just in time to let the light in. The last image is the horizon, glowing pale gold, waves shimmering like glass, the world caught between day and night. The music fades to silence, fade to white, resolution through grace.